Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 249 to 266. Chapter 249 A Jealous Lover. After having his little discussion with Honoria, Berengar sent her away from his office, claiming that he had work to do. She was happy to oblige and thus left Berengar alone in the room. Not long after Lind arrived and appeared rather upset. The moment she closed the door behind her, Berengar knew he was in trouble. Lind stood before Berengar's desk while staring him down. After a few moments of awkward silence, she sighed before sitting down and resting her pretty face on the palm of her hand before speaking. "I can't leave you alone with the girl, can I?" Berengar had a worried expression on his face. He was well aware of how dangerous Lind could be when she was upset, and though it was a misunderstanding, she would not easily believe him. Thus he tried to explain his innocence to his lover. "I swear I am innocent. I simply did her a favor, and she latched onto me like a leech. How was I supposed to know she is so clingy?" Linda's sky-blue eyes stared at Berengar with a curious gaze before she asked the question on her mind. "You did her a favor, huh? What might that be?" Berengar had nothing to hide, and as such, he explained the conversation he had with Honoria. "I merely told that since she was interested in sailing, I could hire someone to teach her how to sail a riverboat properly. If she was interested further, I could always send her to the naval academy I am building sometime in the future." Lind had a hard time believing Berengar's words. After all, the girl was clinging to him so tightly, and thus she narrowed her gaze at Berengar to see if he was lying. Though Berengar was nervous, he was innocent of any foul play, and as such, he returned Linda's glare with one of grit. Seeing how Berengar wasn't lying, Lind sighed before giving him a friendly warning. "Don't let that little vixen dig her claws into your heart. If she turns out to be the Byzantine princess, it could only bring trouble." Berengar nodded his head in response as if he understood Linda's message. Though in reality, he had begun to reconsider his options regarding this so-called Lady Valeria. If the girl was Princess Honoria, then several paths presented themselves on how to proceed. Lind was no fool the moment she saw Berengar nod his head. The look in his eyes flashed from being genuine to being deceitful, and thus she glared at him before demanding answers from him. "Just what is it that you are thinking in that scheming mind of yours?" When Berengar heard that Lind had already discovered he was plotting something, he smiled bitterly before revealing this thought. "I can't hide anything from you, can I? Fine, I will tell you my schemes." Hearing this, Berengar poured himself and his lover a drink as they began to chat about his plans. He ran a chalice of fortified wine for himself, but since he and Lind aimed to have another child, he poured her a cup filled with water. "Let's say that the girl is Princess Honoria. Aside from appeasing the Byzantines and preventing a diplomatic crisis, what can we possibly gain from shipping her back to the empire?" When Lind heard this, she thought about it for a few moments and answered her question. "We could potentially gain their gratitude, further increasing the amount of trade we have with them. Isn't that enough?" When Berengar heard this, he wagged his finger and clicked his tongue. "Tisk tisk tisk, you are thinking too small, my dear. If she is the princess and has fallen for me, why not take advantage of this and have a son with her? If I do this, my dynasty gains a claim to the Byzantine Empire, a weak claim sure, but enough to depose the next emperor if he proves hostile to us." Lind looked at Berengar as if she were speaking to a madman before expressing the thoughts on her mind. "That is a little risky. If the Byzantines find out we are harboring their runaway princess with the intent for you to make her into another one of your consorts, they will surely take action against us." To this, Berengar leaned back in his chair and smiled before speaking his opinion on the matter. "By the time they can take any practical action against us aside from severing trade, our army and navy will be greater than theirs. It will take years for them to conquer North Africa, assuming they ever find out that we harbor the princess. How many people know what she looks like? How many of them are here in Kufstein? Only Aretha's would be able to reveal her identity, but she can easily be hidden from him. Sure, there is a significant risk, but there is an even greater reward. Even if they do paint a picture of her and use it as a bounty for her safe return, let's be honest, how many people will recognize her? The artistic talent of people these days is not exactly lifelike. Not like the artists I have fostered here in Kufstein. Of course, all of this relies on the fact that she is the princess. If she is who she claims she is, then I have no interest in the girl, and you can rest easy." After hearing this, Lind sighed before looking deeply into Berengar's eyes and asking the question on her mind. So you don't have feelings for her? Berengar smiled with a wide grin on his face while leaning back into his chair. As usual, he was blatantly honest with his lover on how he felt about the other women around him. At the moment, no, I am simply planning for the future. However, if she proves to be Princess Honoria and my plans come to fruition, which is to say I do not fall for the girl. After all, her innocence is quite charming, and I have more than enough love to give to 3 women. To this, Lind scoffed. It was hard enough balancing things with Adela. If a third girl entered the picture into their already complex relationship, she knew she would have a headache. Despite this, she also knew that once Berengar had set his mind to something, it was impossible to convince him otherwise. As such, she took a hold of the chalice she was provided and quickly downed its contents, carefully making sure not to spill a single drop of the water within before responding to Berengar's audacious claims. I hope you know what you are doing. Before Lind could get up and walk away, Berengar spoke again, instantly gluing her attention to the words he spoke. Of course, there is another option available. I could always marry the girl and seal an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. Though this would require effective diplomacy, and at the very least, I would have to elevate my status to that of a king, in order to gain the emperor's approval. Hearing this, Lind was shocked and immediately began to stare at Berengar as if he were a scoundrel. You would break your betrothal to Adela for this woman you barely know. To this insinuation, Berengar feigned offense as he clarified his thoughts to his lover. Why, Lind, I am offended that you would suggest such a thing. You know how much I love my little fiancé. Of course not, but who is to say I am limited to one wife? As king, I could easily enact polygyny. After all, with my new succession laws, it will not be an issue for the future of the kingdom, and if the reformists have a problem with it, I can always justify it with the fact that Abraham had multiple wives. Hearing this, Lind stared at Berengar with shock for a few moments before expressing the thoughts on her mind. You have truly thought through everything, haven't you? To this, Berengar nodded his head with a smug grin on his face before answering in the most arrogant way possible. Someone has to, do they not? After hearing this, Lind smiled before departing, though after she left, that smile quickly shifted to a frown. She was not happy about this new arrival or Berengar's plans for her. As such, she quickly got to work writing a letter to Adela to inform her about the appearance of a new rival in their complicated relationship. Perhaps together, the 2 girls could convince Berengar not to go through with such a thing. Of course, Berengar had no idea that his 2 women would begin to scheme behind his back to prevent Honoria from entering his little harem. After all, he was much too busy overseeing the management of the Duchy of Austria and implementing a series of reforms that would change the political and legal landscape of the realm for the foreseeable future. Under his guidance, the industrial age would soon be forced upon Austria. If he wanted his territory to enter the new era peacefully, significant changes would have to be drafted to his rudimentary constitution and transitional government. Chapter 250 More Constitutional Reforms. A new day had arrived, and with it, Berengar had found himself thrust headfirst into work and approving his reforms. The first order of business was redrafting his constitution so that it could apply to the entirety of the duchy. As the Duke of Austria who had just put down the rebellion of his most disloyal subjects not long ago, Berengar was in a unique position to overhaul his territory. As such, he was currently in the process of fixing some of the errors of his constitution that he had previously established. For example, he was moving away from the House of Commons and House of Lords to implement a more streamlined bicameral legislation partially based upon the early days of the United States Constitution from his past life. A House of Representatives was established as the lower house of his bicameral legislature. These representatives would be voted in by those people who met the qualifications to vote, such as German men of upstanding character and proven intellect. The second department of his legislature was the Senate, which was voted in by the county legislatures. Much like America, the House of Representatives would be determined by the total population, while the Senate would have 2 individuals per state, or in this case, county, as senators. These representatives and senators had a term limit of 4 years. If deemed incompetent, corrupt, or any other number of charges, could be removed by the executive and replaced with a person of his choosing until the next election. The House and Senate work was similar to that of the United States but functioned in a more streamlined manner. Those would first introduce a bill, which would be sent to the Senate for retirement or acceptance when passed by a majority vote. From there, it would be given to the Duke, where he could either sign it into law, revise it to his wishes, and then send it back to the Senate for approval once more, or veto it. Unlike the American Constitution, there was no overriding of a duke's veto, though the bill could still be reintroduced through the legislative process. However, a veto was usually considered a firm stance by the duke that he did not desire such a law. The so-called House of Lords would be repurposed as the Duke's Council, which essentially acted as a cabinet. Their responsibility would be to help lead Berengar's reforms while serving under him. The Duke's Council could be appointed and dismissed at any time according to the reigning Duke's determination. Part of the Duke's Council's responsibilities were selecting a successor to the Duke in the event that the Duke had passed away without appointing a successor himself. The process to this was voting upon eligible members of the von Kufstein dynasty for the position. Whoever had the most votes was chosen. This was a fail-safe, established so that the most competent successor would be chosen in the event that the Duke was to pass away before selecting the best candidate from his dynasty to replace him. The Duke's Council would only choose the successor in very limited circumstances. The executive branch of government was ruled by the Duke at a federal level. As for a state and local level, the reigning noble of the territory would act as governor. They would still need to introduce a localized form of government such as a state legislature and court system to aid them in their reign. The nobility who ruled over their territories were allowed to continue to do so as governors, though the succession laws that applied to the Duke were also applied to all governors. This was to ensure the most competent person was selected as the governor of their region. Of course, each duke had executive powers, which allowed them to pass legislation without the approval of the federal and county legislatures. However, these could just as quickly be repealed by the next duke. This was to ensure the political power of Berengar and his descendants so that they did not just become another powerless figurehead. With the legislative and executive branches refined, the judicial branch was further elaborated and based upon the American Republic from Berengar's previous life. With a Supreme Court, which determined what was legal based upon the Constitution. As with all judges, these Supreme Court justices were appointed by the Duke and served for life. However, if the Duke determined that they had failed to fulfill their duties according to the law and instead operated on some form of personal agenda, he could have them removed and replaced. This constitutional system allowed for some semblance of freedom while still retaining significant control of the government in the hands of Berengar and his dynasty. In doing so, he created a semi-constitutional monarchy, as in practice, Berengar still had the power to effectively make any decision he pleased and could stack the government in his favor. He also maintained a strict stance of a small, intelligent electorate comprised of full-blooded law-abiding German males, preventing any foreign influence in his elections as the non-German minority had no voting rights whatsoever. Thus maintaining the idea of a united German fatherland for years to come. Of course, he once more allowed a transitional period of 10 years where he still ruled as an absolute monarch. This transitional period could be further extended by the Duke if deemed necessary. This way, he could slowly assimilate his territory into his new style of government. After drafting these constitutional reforms, Berengar sighed heavily. He had spent a lot of time and effort revising his constitution. It would also likely change in the future when he went from Duke to King to Emperor. For now, this was the best effort he could put forth. With this, Lind arrived in his room and placed a flagon of beer on Berengar's desk, and in her own hands was a goblet filled with milk. She took a look at the reforms and noticed the exhausted expression on her lover's face. After doing so, she sighed before commenting on Berengar's work. "You do realize that when word of this gets out, the neighboring duchies and kingdoms will be even more upset with you than they currently are. You are single-handedly overhauling centuries of governance into something new which greatly strips away the nobility's power." To this, Berengar laughed as he grabbed a hold of Linda's perfectly shaped face before expressing his views on the matters at hand. Sure, the nobility loses their ability to draft troops, issue their currency, and own all of the lands. However, they will still act as de facto governors of their territory and will have more wealth than before when my reforms go into place. At the moment, most noblemen gain their wealth by taxing poor peasants. With the industrial age upon us, businesses will boom, and goods will be sold. The common people will grow wealthier and afford nice houses, which the currency they use to purchase the land to build those houses upon will go into the hands of the nobility, who currently own that land. It is not like I am taking all of the lands of nobles away from them. They will still have vast swaths of territory, and they will more than make up the loss of land with shares in the businesses that are bound to sprawl across Austria in the coming years. The nobles may not hold all of the wealth of the duchy in their hands, but they will be wealthier than they were before, and that is all that matters. When the neighboring kingdoms realize that our realm's nobility is more affluent than they are, they will grow envious and spiteful. They might lash out against us, but we have the power of industry on our side, and their feudal armies have already proven not to be the match of my professional army. Hearing Berengar's long-winded speech about the forthcoming age, Lind grew wide-eyed as she imagined what it would be like. She greatly admired Berengar's vision for the future and the lengths he was willing to go to achieve it. Thus she wrapped her arms around her lover, and gazed at the latest draft of the Constitution, and asked another question that was on her mind. In the end, all the power rests in your hands, doesn't it? Everything else is just a ruse to appease the commoners and the nobles. According to this constitution, you can pretty much replace anyone you don't like in the government with someone who supports you. To this, Berengar smiled and took a sip from his beer. After doing so, he thought about it deeply for some time before responding. The average person can't be trusted with any semblance of political power. Even if I were to make my population fully literate, the masses would never understand the inner workings of government. They inevitably will vote into power people who promise to give them the most benefits at the expense of the nation. With that, corruption will take hold of society, and the nation will slowly decline into total collapse. Only by maintaining an educated and intelligent electorate can a Republican-style government genuinely thrive. However, the more literate people become, the more they will ultimately want representation. Thus, if I try to hold on to all the power like a despot, there will inevitably be a revolution. Creating a lasting empire is built upon compromise. With this, I hope to make a long-lasting system where our descendants maintain power, and those intelligent enough to understand how the government works are placated with appropriate representation of their interests. Hearing this, Lind nodded her head, and a sly smile appeared on her face. In other words, the Duke knows best, right? To this, Berengar chuckled before responding. I suppose you could say that. Thus with this, the Constitution of the Duchy of Austria was drafted, in a system that somewhat resembled a limited republic, while still giving significant control to the nobility and the Duke. Berengar had carefully drafted a constitution that he felt limited the negative effects of constitutional republics and monarchies alike while still maintaining a significant degree of control for himself and his dynasty. Chapter 251 Adela's Concerns. Within the city of Graz, deep inside the belly of its castle, was a young woman in the middle of her adolescent years. This girl was Adela von Graz, the fiancée of the infamous Duke Berengar von Kufstein. While Berengar was beginning to introduce a series of legal reforms that would shock the European world, his fiancée was reading a letter written to her by her rival in love. This rival was none other than Lind von Habsburg. With the arrival of Princess Honoria, Lind felt a significant threat to her position and thought it was necessary to inform Adela about the situation since Berengar had purposely neglected to mention the appearance of a new potential rival. This letter did not openly entail the secret that Lind suspected this young woman from the East to be the lost princess of the East. Instead, it merely introduced her as a young maiden lying about her identity and trying to get close to Berengar. However, as Adela read the contents, her expression began to sink. She was well aware of the relationship between Berengar and Lind at this point. After all, it was common knowledge. She had even come to terms with the idea of Berengar taking a lover on the side and had convinced herself that great men were capable of doing such a thing. However, news of a foreign beauty from the East who was potentially lying about her identity while trying to capture Berengar's attention was something Adela did not take lightly. Judging by the contents of the letter, Adela figured there was more to the story. If Lind was worried about this new arrival to the point where she would write a letter to Adela, it was a fairly serious situation. Adela lay down upon her bed as she read the contents of the letter with a pouting face. She instantly voiced her discontent with the situation. Berengar, you dummy. Adela had a quick wit, and she instantly looked closer at the letter. Perhaps something that she missed would explain Linda's worry more adequately. After studying the letter, Adela found it was written in code. If she could write down the first letter of every third word, it formed an expression of its own. She quickly began to decipher the content, and after writing it down on a separate piece of paper, two words stuck out like a sore thumb. Princess Honoria. Adela was not too familiar with the royal court of the Byzantine Empire, and as such, was utterly unaware of who Princess Honoria was. Still, the fact that this young maiden from the east had the title of princess could only mean one thing. Adela's position as the primary wife was being threatened. After all, if Berengar were to add a princess to his collection of beautiful young women, then indeed it made sense for him to marry her instead, especially if she came from a powerful kingdom. With this news, the young girl was beginning to nibble on her thumbs in anxiety. After careful consideration, she realized that her 14th birthday was around the corner, and she would have to have a conversation with Berengar about this when he finally arrived. As such, she wrote a letter to Lind thanking her for informing her of these matters and requesting her presence at her birthday so the two of them could confront Berengar about this issue together. After writing the letter, Adela heard a knock on her door. As such, she quickly walked over to the door and opened it, revealing the voluptuous figure of her eldest sister Ava, who by now had a worrisome expression on her face. Since Berengar's reconquest of Austria, Ava's husband Wolfgang had been deposed as Count of Salzburg and replaced by his younger brother at Berengar's behest. Despite her and her husband's apologies for their actions while Berengar stayed in Graz, the man had gone through with his threat. He thoroughly removed Wolfgang from any position of authority. He did so while Conrad was still alive, and he was the regent of Austria. Since then, Wolfgang and Ava had permanently moved to Graz at the behest of the new Count of Salzburg. After all, the man could never forgive his older brother for forsaking their homeland and fleeing Steiermark while Salzburg was embroiled in warfare. Since then, Ava and her husband had become humbled, and with Adela being the fiancée of the new Duke of Austria, Ava no longer found her for the daily conflict. Instead, she had begun to grovel at Adela's feet so that the young girl might convince her future husband to restore Wolfgang's position. Thus, after Adela saw Ava in her doorway, she began to sigh and shake her head as she asked Ava the question on her mind. "What now, Ava? I am a little bit busy." Ava could tell that Adela was distressed, which was unusual for the little girl who was usually so full of life. As such, she instantly saw it as a way to curry favor with her younger sister. Thus Ava put on a worried facade and returned Adela's question with one of her own. "Little Adela, is everything all right? You look quite upset." Though Adela knew what games Ava was playing, she honestly didn't care, as it would be nice to vent her frustrations to someone. As such, she opened the door all the way and allowed Ava into the room before she sat down on her bed and hugged her pillow. "A princess is visiting Berengar, and I am afraid he will try to marry her instead." Ava was quite shocked by this. When she had tried to seduce Berengar, he paid no attention to her natural charms. Thus she was also quite upset when she heard some other woman had begun to attempt to latch onto her little sister's beloved fiancé. However, she hid her inner fury and tried to console Adela instead. "A princess, huh? What princess? Do you know her name and what kingdom she is from?" Hearing this, Adela merely shook her head before responding to her sister as she stared at the floor. "I have never heard of her before. Do you know who Princess Honoria is?" Ava had to think about it for a few moments before a light sparkled in her eyes, and she remembered where she had heard the name. "Where did you hear that Princess Honoria had visited Berengar?" "That should not be possible. As far as I know, there is only one princess by that name, the imperial princess of the Byzantine Empire. Supposedly she is quite the beauty. However, she has been locked up in the palace her entire life and is restricted from interacting with outsiders. There is no possible way she has visited Kufstein to see Berengar. Her father the emperor wouldn't allow it." Hearing this, Adela's eyes lit up, and the dread she felt began to fade away. She might have been reading too much into the letter. Still, the odds of a hidden message like what she had found by pure coincidence were entirely non-existent. As such, she decided to show Ava the letter, and after explaining to her how she found out about the princess's name, a scowl formed on Ava's face as she tried to think through what this meant. Eventually, Ava came to a conclusion and began to suggest what she thought the message conveyed to her little sister. In the actual letter, it appears as if this girl is going by the name Valeria Zonera, and she claims she is from Antioch. However, Lind suspects she is lying about her identity. The hidden message might be the guess she has about her identity. I highly doubt that it is Princess Honoria, unless, of course, she ran away from home to visit Berengar, but that's impossible, right? I mean, how would she even know who Berengar is? Let alone how could she get to Kufstein by herself? This has to be some form of mistake. Adela nodded at Ava's comment. It made sense. However, she also knew Linda's character well enough to know that she would never panic like this and send Adela an encrypted message with a suspected identity unless she was positive about her conclusion. Thus, her sister's comments did little to calm Adela's nerves, despite the sound logic. After a few moments of thinking things through, Adela realized there was no point worrying about such a thing. She would have to confront Berengar when he arrived for her birthday. It was not far away, and she could wait patiently for an answer until then. Seeing Adela cheer up, Ava began to ask her the question that was actually on her mind. Now that you are in a better mood, can you ask your fiancé to restore Wolfgang's position for me? Hearing this, Adela merely rolled her eyes and began to push Ava out of her room. Get out of my room, Ava. Despite Ava's protests, she eventually found herself on the other side of the door pouting. This was the 13th time she had asked Adela today, and as per usual, she was rejected. She would have to find some other way to convince the girl to talk to her fiancé about the issue at hand. Chapter 252 Berengar and Honoria. While Berengar was in the middle of his usual office work, Honoria patiently waited outside his study. Even though she was allowed to move within the city of Kufstein freely, she mainly had stayed inside the castle, waiting for opportune moments to approach the man that had caught her interest. Because Berengar was constantly guarded by Linda's watchful gaze, Honoria had few opportunities to get to know Berengar very well. Berengar had not responded well to her advances up to this point. At least not as well as she had hoped. She was beginning to doubt her charm. After all, Berengar already had Lind, a woman so beautiful she was dubbed one of the 3 heavenly beauties of Austria. Even Honoria had begun to doubt her charms when in comparison to Berengar's lover. Nevertheless, she was undeterred. So long as she was staying in Kufstein, she wanted to find out more about Berengar and determine whether or not he was indeed fit to be her man. Thus she was waiting outside his study door, so she could, conveniently, run into him, giving her an excuse to ask him to lunch. After several hours of waiting around the castle, Berengar finally receded from his seclusion. When he did, Honoria immediately began to walk by and attempted to bump into him casually. However, she somehow ended up tripping over the air and fell to the ground. Luckily, as she was falling, Berengar reacted and grabbed a hold of her, steadying the young princess on her feet as he did so. Berengar gazed worriedly into Honoria's mint-green pupils as he asked the question on his mind. Are you okay? Honoria began to blush as she stared into Berengar's one good eye. His charming face gazing at her with worry filled her heart with feelings she was uncertain about. Thus she looked away and pulled herself from his grasp, standing on her own 2 feet. I am fine. Seeing her embarrassed, Berengar laughed and nodded his head as he expressed his thoughts. Good, that's good. After saying this, Berengar began to depart. It was about lunchtime, and every day he would meet up with Lind at this time to share a meal. It was what you could call their daily date. However, the moment he began to walk away, Honoria started to panic and quickly grabbed a hold of his puffy sleeve, stopping him in his tracks. After doing so, Berengar looked behind him to see what was obstructing his journey to see Honoria's cheeks flushed as red as can be, her eyes fixed to the ground in front of her as she did so. She was holding onto her chest with her free hand and seemed to have difficulty getting the words out. After a few moments of Berengar staring at her, Honoria finally managed to work up the courage in her heart and quickly voiced her thoughts. Will you have lunch with me? Berengar thought about this for a few moments before shrugging his shoulders and agreeing to her request. Sure, why not? He ate lunch with Lind every day. She would not be too upset if he missed a day, would she? Upon hearing this, Honoria's eyes lighted up in response, filled with excitement. She quickly grabbed a hold of Berengar's hands, her heart fluttering as she did so. Do you mean it? To this, Berengar was taken aback ever so slightly. However, he did not reveal it on his handsome face, and instead, he patted the girl on the head and nodded his head before responding. Of course. Honoria nearly passed out from excitement upon hearing this. Nevertheless, she quickly got a hold of herself and explained the date she had planned during the previous night. She had stayed up late thinking about it. I thought we could go to one of the sandwich shops in Kufstein. I have never tried such food before, and I felt as if it would be exciting. To this, Berengar nodded his head in agreement. It was good to eat a sandwich every once in a while. After all, he dined exclusively on top-quality German cuisine while living in the castle. As such, he responded to her idea positively. An excellent idea, I know just the place. If you would follow me, I would be more than happy to escort you. With that, Berengar offered his arm, where Honoria quickly latched onto it with a happy grin on her face. Afterward, Berengar led her out of the castle and into the city below. Of course, on the way, he picked up an escort of his guards who closely trailed behind them, watching with careful eyes for any attempt on their sovereign's life. After entering the city, Berengar led Honoria through the streets until they arrived at the old sandwich shop that Berengar had previously taken Adela to during their first date. The city had grown exponentially since then, and thus Berengar felt great nostalgia looking back on what was merely a year ago a small agricultural town. As Berengar entered the sandwich shop, he noticed there was an extensive line. Because Berengar frequently visited the shop in the past, it had become quite the popular destination within the town. The owners even purchased a hold of the nearby buildings and rebuilt the shop into a much larger and more delicate destination that employed over a dozen employees. There was outside dining available for those who desired it, and due to it being the end of summer in the Alps, it was the perfect time to do so. Who knew when Berengar would have another chance at such a thing? As they entered the sandwich shop, the line quickly parted for the Duke and the pretty girl on his arm. The people in line instantly began to comment about the unknown women attached to Berengar. It was commonly known that the Duke had both Adela and Lind, yet the white-haired beauty latched onto him with a loving smile was an unknown entity for the people of Kufstein. Immediately men began to gaze at the Duke with envy and sigh to themselves. They instantly admitted defeat when comparing themselves to Berengar. Helga was quite surprised to see Berengar arrive, as he had not been to her shop for some time. It is not as if Berengar did not desire to do so, it is simply a matter of not having the time. If Honoria had not approached him for a date, he would not have likely come to this place any time soon. As such, the woman had a pleasant smile on her face as she greeted the man who was not long ago a baron's son. Your Grace, it is good to see you are doing well. It has been some time. Who is this lovely maiden so lovingly attached to your arm? Upon hearing that, Honoria could see the gazes of those around her narrowing with curiosity as they too wondered just what kind of girl Berengar had picked up now. The young girl's pale face instantly began to flush as he heard the grown woman speak. In response to this, Berengar smiled as he introduced Honoria by the pseudonym she had given him. This is Lady Valeria. She is from the Byzantine Empire and is here in Kufstein for trade. I am simply treating her to some of the local delicacies. Though Berengar did not introduce her as yet another of his girls, the bystanders refused to believe that Berengar had no intentions of making such a beautiful young maiden a member of his ducal harem. After all, he was well renowned as a shameless lecher by the men of Kufstein, on that they all greatly envied. Helga nodded as she heard this. She too suspected something more serious between the couple, but if Berengar did not want to publicly announce her relationship to the girl, it was far from her position to inquire. Thus she asked a far more appropriate question. What can I get you, Your Grace? Berengar immediately responded with what he had on his mind. After all, such food was new to Honoria. I would like a basket from of bierox and 2 pitchers of fresh milk. Hearing this, Helga nodded her head and responded with a smile. Coming right up. After doing so, Berengar took a few silver pfennigs from his coin pouch and handed them over to the woman, where she immediately began to decline. Your Grace, you do not have to pay. It would be rude for me to ask that of you. However, Berengar merely laughed at the woman's response and joked about it. How do you stay in business? To this, the mature woman blushed, and Berengar forced the coins into her hands. I can't have you and your employees working for free just because I am the Duke. You deserve to get paid for your services. With that, he walked away with Honoria by his side, where they sat at the outside dining area while waiting for their food. Chapter 253 Berengar and Honoria 2. Eventually, the food arrived. It was a tray filled with bierox and 2 bottles of fresh milk. The bierock was a Volga German dish from his past life. In other words, it originated from a group of German immigrants who had moved to Russia during the 18th century with the purpose of farming Russian land. This occurred during Berengar's past life. They were allowed to maintain their own culture, and as such, some very unique cuisines originated from the Volga Germans. Berengar could partially trace his ancestry back to these people and had plenty of their recipes within his brain. The bierock was a roll stuffed with hamburger meat and cabbage. It may not sound like much, but to Berengar, it was delicious, and it was easy to make. The delicacy had become quite popular as a lunch food within Kufstein and was beginning to spread to the rest of Austria. After sitting in awkward silence while eating the food for some time, Berengar finally tried to create a conversation with Honoria, and so he asked something simple about her background. Even though she was lying to him, the girl was not very good at it, and he knew anything he inquired about regarding her past would most likely be accurate. "So, Lady Valeria, tell me about yourself. Do you have any siblings?" After hearing this, Honoria was snapped out of her daze and caught off guard. She had not thought too deeply about her background and thus opted to be honest. After all, she did not know how to make up a lie on the spot. "I have 3 brothers, all of them older than me." Berengar nodded his head at this, though she had no way of knowing he was asking simple questions based on what he knew about the Byzantine royal family's makeup, and what she had just said acted as another confirmation of his suspicions. "What is your relationship with your brothers? Do you get along at all?" Hearing this, Honoria went silent and began to fidget with her hands, not knowing how to respond. She thought about what to say next deeply before responding once more with the truth. After all, she was growing more fond of Berengar by the day, and it was better to be honest about small stuff like this than make up a completely fabricated background about herself and have to explain her real past later on. Thus she sighed before entertaining Berengar's thoughts. "I would not say we get along, but we certainly aren't on bad terms either. Growing up, they mainly left me alone. My father was pretty strict since I was his only daughter, and he made it well known to my siblings that I was special. They looked out for me, but honestly, I think deep down they were deeply envious of how pampered I was." Berengar nodded his head as he listened to her story. By the look on Honoria's face, she did not want to speak of her past anymore at the moment. However, Honoria's following words shifted the conversation out of his favor. "What about you? Is Henrietta your only sibling?" Berengar could tell the girl was honest with him, and as such, he decided to do so as well. His fists began to curl as he reflected upon the past. While doing so, he spoke in a grave tone. "I had a brother." After hearing this, Honoria was naturally curious and thus asked the question on her mind. "Had?" To this, Berengar sighed heavily before admitting the truth. "He tried to kill me multiple times. You could say he was envious of me, insofar that he wanted what was naturally mine by right. For this, he was disowned and sent to the Teutonic Order." Honoria could tell there was more to this story and thus asked about this once more. "And then?" Berengar's eyes shifted over to Honoria's as he witnessed the inquisitive gaze in her eyes. However, he ultimately decided not to reveal the result of Lambert's death, at least not at the moment, and thus, he calmly replied to her with a determined expression. "That is a tale for another time." Honoria quickly realized that Berengar wanted to shift the conversation. As such, she asked another question about him. After all, her curiosity about the man would not be fulfilled with a single query. "So I heard from some people around town that all of these magnificent changes that have occurred in Austria over the past year are solely because of you. Where did you get all of these ideas from?" Berengar smiled and laughed as Honoria commented on this. He decided to mess around with the girl and leaned in class to her before whispering. "Do you know what reincarnation is?" Surprisingly to this, Honoria nodded her head. "One of my brothers once talked to me about it. He heard about it from some merchant from the Far East. It is supposedly the idea that when you die you are born into the body of another person, right? What does that have to do with your ideas?" Berengar nodded his head while he continued to tease the girl. "Suppose I were to say I was reincarnated, from the distant future, in a world far more advanced from this one. What would you say?" Surprisingly, the girl did not call him crazy or think he was joking. Instead, she took it seriously and looked at Berengar with disbelief. She quickly blurted out the thought on her mind. "Are you serious?" With this, Berengar knew he had revealed something he shouldn't have. If the girl believed him, that could create some troubles, and as such, he quickly shook his head and denied the reality. "No, I was just joking, Valeria. You shouldn't take comments like this so seriously." To this, Honora chuckled awkwardly before responding to Berengar. "Of course, I knew that." After saying so, Honoria began to pout. She did not enjoy being made fun of, especially by Berengar. Noticing that she was displeased, Berengar made up some story about how he came to understand these things. "There's a lot of good information in old books. You'd be surprised what you can find in them. I took their ideas, thought about them for a while, and deduced the things I created. Without those who laid the groundwork before me, I never would have been able to dream up of what I know. Honoria bought this line immediately. It sounded far more feasible than being reincarnated into the past from the distant future. Seeing that Berengar was supposedly honest with her, she began to lighten up. Berengar, of course, took advantage of this to push the conversation back towards Honoria. So now that I have told you something interesting about me, why don't you tell me something interesting about yourself? Honoria froze to this. She did not have anything interesting to say about herself, for she genuinely believed that besides being the princess of the Byzantine Empire, there was nothing remotely interesting about her. As such, her expression suddenly turned downcast, and Berengar began to change the subject. So these Biroks are pretty good, aren't they? The moment Honoria heard Berengar voluntarily change the subject because of her sadness, she felt touched and put a smile on her face while sniffling back the tear that had formed in her eye. Yeah, they're perfect. I can't believe your people eat such delicacies daily. With the simplicity of the meal and the burgeoning middle class, such food was relatively inexpensive, healthy, and exceptionally filling, especially when paired with a glass of milk. As such, the birok had become a standard item in the hands of those who could afford it. Honoria shifted the conversation to another question on her mind as she ate from her meal. So I hear you weren't always this amazing. Some people even refer to you as a completely different person than you were 2 years ago. However, nobody ever elaborates, as if they are afraid to speak about it. So I have to ask, what were you like when you were younger? Berengar chuckled lightly at this answer. He was not afraid of his past before his reincarnation, so he answered honestly. Honestly, I was a weak, lazy fool who tended to throw a tantrum whenever something didn't go his own way. Though I am not proud of it, I have thrown more than my fair share of chalices at people because they insulted me. I am amazed I lived as long as I did because of how much of a pompous ass I was. Honoria was shocked when she heard this. Compared to the man sitting before her, she simply could not believe Berengar was once such a man. Unable to contain her curiosity, she asked about it. If you don't mind me asking, what change? Berengar sighed heavily as he looked away towards the mountains in the distance with a bitter smile on his face. As if he was reminiscing about something serious, after doing so he responded in a grave tone. Somebody close to me poisoned me, I survived it, and I suppose you could say being on the brink of death, I realized how much I had wasted my life and desired to turn it around. I am amazed at the man I have become in such a short time. Hearing this, Honoria's mouth fell agape. However, she was relatively sharp and quickly pieced 2 and 2 together despite being naive. She had an awkward expression on her face as she asked her next question. Was the person who poisoned you your brother? To this question, Berengar sighed as he stood up from his seat and reached out his hand towards Honoria with a bitter smile. It is getting late. I will have to answer that question some other time. She noticed that Berengar did not want to talk about such a painful topic any longer. Thus Honoria grabbed hold of his hand where he proceeded to lift the princess to her feet. After doing so, the two walked back towards the castle, gazing at each other with affection as they held onto each other's hands like a loving couple. Chapter 254 Appeasing Two Women. While Berengar was off at lunch with Honoria, Lind had been left behind. The beautiful young lover of the Duke was sitting in the middle of the dining hall in her seat gazing at Berengar's empty spot with a downcast expression. Her doll-like face was resting in her dainty hands as she blew out her mouth, trying to lift her bangs with her breath. She was dreadfully bored and did not know what was taking Berengar so long. For the past few months, Berengar and Lind had synced their lunch schedules so that they could enjoy a meal together every day as a couple. Yet, for whatever reason, the man which her heart yearned for was not present. There was nothing Lind could do about this, and thus she waited patiently like a loyal dog. After well over an hour, the doors to the castle opened, and Berengar entered the scene. Though he had no intent to go to the dining room, Lind quickly found her way to the entrance. When she noticed that Berengar was holding hands with another woman other than Adela, she instantly began to frown. She gave Berengar the chilling stare of someone about to commit murder. The moment Berniger witnessed this perilous gaze, chills were sent down his spine, and he instantly reacted by ripping his hand away from Honoria. This caused the teenage princess to pout. No matter what, she could not seem to get one over on Lind. The two young women glared at each other with vicious intent for several moments before Berniger broke the silence. Sweetheart, what are you doing waiting around at this hour? Should you not be at work? The moment Lind heard this, her attention snapped from Honoria to Berengar, and she immediately began to pout. In doing so, she turned her head to the side, not even dignifying her lover with a glance. At this moment, Berengar knew that Lind was truly angry with him, and thus he began to apologize. "I'm sorry. Valeria approached me first and asked me to accompany her, you understand, don't you?" With this, Lind still did not look in his eye. She was genuinely furious at her lover at this point. Though she was aware Berengar intended to make the girl a concubine or another wife, she honestly did not care. She was most upset that Berengar was willing to enact polygamy because this little vixen was quite possibly a princess and not because he loved herself enough to make her a proper bride. Berengar was not wise enough to notice the underlying reason for Linda's fury, and thus Lind did not accept his apology. Honoria saw this as an opportunity to take Berengar for herself, and she ran up to Berengar and grabbed a hold of his arm, burrowing it deep within her cleavage, in doing so intended to make Berengar aware that she too was well developed. The sight of this nearly made Linda's eyes pop out, and she instantly began to frown. However, before she could discuss her dissatisfaction, Honoria began to insult her. "Lind, you are rather unfair to Berengar. All he did was listen to a small request of mine. I mean, it is not like you had lunch plans already. For all you know, we were merely discussing business. There is no reason to be so jealous." The moment Lind heard herself be called jealous, she wanted to grab a hold of Honoria and strangle her. This little brat was taking things too far. However, she managed to contain her fury and instead approached Honoria and questioned her story. "Were you discussing business?" Berengar tried to interrupt, but Lind merely lifted her hand and shooshed him. In response, Honoria put on a pretty smile and spoke the words that she knew targeted Linda's insecurities. "Of course not. We were discussing our wedding plans." Upon hearing this, Lind nearly started swinging. Meanwhile, Honoria stuck out her tongue at the already outraged Lind while Berengar tried to soothe her. By the time he turned his head around, Honoria had begun the act of innocence. Though Berengar had not seen the act, judging by Linda's sour expression, Honoria had done yet another thing to provoke his lover. As such, he began to become slightly perturbed by the girl's childish behavior and began to raise his voice as he addressed her. "That's enough, Valeria, you are taking this joke too far." Hearing this, Valeria was shocked. She had never been scolded before in such a way and felt heartbroken. It was only a small joke, but Berengar had raised his voice. The authoritative voice of a male who had been scorned was not something a sheltered princess like Honoria had ever witnessed before, and thus she slowly began to break out into tears. Before the waterworks could fully erupt, she ran off to her room like a spoiled child. When she was finally out of earshot, Lind merely crossed her arms and looked away from Berengar while pouting. While doing so, she muttered under her breath, "Shouldn't you go check up on her? A spoiled brat like her has probably never had a man raise his voice to her before." Seeing the way Lind was looking at him broke Berengar's heart, and instead, he grabbed a hold of her hands and gave his command to Lind. "Look at me." Lind was startled, but she refused to break to Berengar's command. When Berengar saw this, he raised his voice to Lind just like he had done to Honoria. While doing so, he yanked her into his embrace and grabbed a hold of her pouting cheeks. "Lind," I said, "look at me." Hearing this, Linda's training was triggered, and she obediently looked at Berengar, who had an affectionate smile on his face. Rather than being angry, the gaze in his eyes was filled with love, as such stuffed her head into his chest and gently stroked her silky strawberry blonde hair while whispering in her ear. "I think I understand why you are angry. You are mad because I said I intend to enact polygamy to marry her and create an alliance with the Byzantine Empire, aren't you? My silly girl, do you think that I would ever leave you out of such a thing? Of course, I intend to marry you first. I have had this idea for quite some time. You deserve a proper wedding and the title of my wife. Even if you aren't the empress of the empire that I will one day forge, you will still be my wife." Hearing this, tears began to stream down Linda's exquisite face. She was significantly wounded when Berengar said he intended to marry Honoria and had failed to mention her fate. For too long, she had desired to be with Berengar more than as just a lover, but due to Berengar's affection towards Adela, she knew she could never fulfill such a place in his life. When he had stated he might one day enact polygamy, she was ecstatic but worried at the same time since Berengar did not explicitly state that he would marry her as well. Instead, he mentioned Honoria as a potential candidate for a second wife. Hearing this Berengar express his intent to marry Lind made her happier than anything else Berengar could have stated at this moment. After tugging on Berengar's collar with an embarrassed expression, Lind whispered to him in a voice so low he almost couldn't hear it. "I love you." Before Berengar could respond, she violated his tongue with her own and pressed him against the wall. Berengar was shocked at first but immediately took control of the situation while reversing their positions. The two began to fondle each other in the middle of the hallway until Lind sighed heavily and pushed Berengar away. This act immensely confused the man. As such, he expressed his doubt towards Linda's actions. "What is it? Did I do something wrong?" Lind sighed again before expressing the thoughts on her mind. "No, it's not that. As much as I want this, I know that little girl is crying up a storm in her room, and I think it would be best that you talk to her before she becomes entrenched in depression. We can always have our fun later tonight." At this, Berengar began to chuckle lightly, and Lind shot him a glare. "What is so funny?" Berengar wiped a small tear from his eye before shaking his head and speaking his mind. "To think you cared so much about the princess that you would give up sex so that I can comfort her when she is dejected. It is funny, it is." This greatly outraged Lind, and she began to blush once more before pushing Berengar in the direction of Honoria's room. "If you don't leave now, I really will have you here and now. Go." Berengar merely laughed his way down the hall, which made Lind even more furious. Once he was out of earshot, Lind sighed once more before a beautiful smile spread across her face. "Why did I have to fall in love with such a playboy?" Berengar, on the other hand, walked towards Honoria's quarters and knocked on her door. After a few moments, all he could hear was sobbing, and thus he knocked once more. After doing so a second time, a meek voice could be heard from the other side. "Come in." Chapter 255 Appeasing Two Women 2. After Berengar had opened the door, he noticed that Honoria was wiping tears from her eyes while trying to put on a calm facade. She was distraught from the scolding Berengar had given her, and despite this, Berengar did not pity her. Frankly, he found the girl to be spoiled, and he wondered how on earth she was raised. Berengar was not the type to tolerate a woman's shit if she stepped over the line, and as such, he had no intention to apologize. Honoria looked at Berengar from the corner of her eye, refusing to stare directly into his cold gaze. After a while, Berengar sat down next to her on his bed and began to lecture the girl about her behavior, albeit in a much gentler tone. "You do realize you were out of line back there. I don't know what kind of conflict you have with Lind, but you should not purposely antagonize the girl." To this, Honoria began to pout without responding. She was greatly displeased that Berengar had come to lecture her instead of apologizing. However, she did not make her thoughts known. Instead, she sulked in silence. Berengar knew full well what she was thinking and elaborated on his thoughts. "I am not going to apologize to you for raising my voice. From what I understand, you have been pampered and spoiled your entire life, and the fact that you expect me to get on my knees and profess my guilt is a sign that you were poorly raised growing up. As long as you are under my care, I will properly discipline you when you step out of line, something your father should have done a long time ago." When Honoria heard this, she began to frown bitterly. Her entire life, she had been doted upon by her father, and it was part of the reason why she acted like such an entitled brat. However, Berengar would not tolerate that behavior. If this girl was Princess Honoria, she needed to be molded into a proper young lady. The fact that Berengar had to become a father figure to this naive, pampered princess was exhausting in its own right, but since her father had utterly failed in that regard, Berengar supposed he could step up to the role. Eventually, Honoria looked over at Berengar with a sheepish expression. Hearing Berengar so boldly declare that he would take care of her bad habits left a favorable impression upon her. The young princess fiddled with her fingers for a few moments before expressing her thoughts. "I am sorry, you spend so much time with Lind and give her so much attention. Seeing her jealous for once made me want to boast." Berengar immediately responded to this with a stern tone. "I am not the one you should be apologizing to. What you said to Lind was vile and mean-spirited. You intentionally targeted her insecurities in an attempt to hurt her, and I will not tolerate such behavior. If you continue to act in such a manner, I will have no choice but to send you back to the Empire." Upon hearing this, Honoria instantly froze, and tears began to fill in her eyes as a pleading expression took hold of her flawless face. The princess latched onto Berengar's hands and began to beg for forgiveness. "Anything but that, please, I will do better. Do not send me back home." Hearing this, Berengar began to chuckle. The look on the girl's face was priceless, and as such, he flicked her on the forehead before responding. "Then you better go apologize to Lind and hope she accepts it. Ultimately, it is up to her whether or not you are allowed to stay in Kufstein." Of course, Berengar did not mean such a thing, but Honoria had no way of knowing this. Thus she quickly got up from the bed and ran out of the room, looking for Lind. Leaving Berengar by his lonesome in the quarters the princess was staying in, he began to sigh and express his thoughts. "I should have stuck with 2 women, balancing a trio of bitches will be the death of me." After saying this, Berengar began to dust himself off as he stood up from his seat and looked towards the entrance that Honoria had run past not long ago. A wry smile appeared on his face as he voiced his thoughts aloud. "Well, it is too late now. I don't know how she managed to do it, but that little brat has somehow managed to burrow her way into my heart. Hopefully, something good can come from this." Berengar moved for the door, where he followed Honoria's steps until he arrived at a scene of the girl prostrating herself before Lind as she apologized for her previous actions. Lind was snickering as she gazed at the princess, lowering herself to a simple concubine. "I am sorry for my cruel words and childish actions. I promise I will behave myself in the future." After listening to Honoria's apology, Lind feigned indifference for some time. This caused a sense of worry to fill Honoria's heart. However, the girl waited with her head bowed until Lind forgave her. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Lind sighed heavily before resting her forehead in the palm of her hand. "Fine, I accept your apology. However, if you purposely try to invoke my ire in the future, I will surely have you shipped back to Antioch." Honoria felt chills down her spine as she heard this, and as such, she quickly raised herself from her kneeling position and nodded her head. Afterward, she said nothing more. Meanwhile, Lind ignored the young princess and went over to Berengar, wrapping her arms around his back and pressing her mighty bosom against his chest. As she did so, the young beauty whispered in Berengar's ears, "Why don't we leave this little brat be and go enjoy ourselves?" A devilish smile appeared on Berengar's face as he grabbed a hold of Linda's plump behind in front of Honoria. This was the punishment that Honoria deserved for her actions. It was now her time to be jealous. Of course, it did not quite work as Berengar had planned, as the couple's flirtatious actions made Honoria flush with embarrassment and cover her eyes. She was far too young and innocent to be witnessing the intimate display between Berengar and Lind as they violated each other's mouths with their tongues. After making out for a few moments, Berengar took Linda's hand and led her away towards their bedchambers. As the two left the room, Lind smirked at Honoria and blew her a kiss before departing with her lover. It would be some time before the two returned from their joint exercise. After doing so, they noticed Honoria sitting in the dining room with a flustered expression. The girl was too embarrassed to move from her seat and was staring off into space. Seeing how it had been well over an hour, and the girl was still shocked by his lecherous behavior, Berengar decided to play a prank on the girl. Thus he snuck up behind her and whispered in the girl's ear, snapping her out of her daze as he did so. "Are you perhaps jealous?" Feeling the warmth of Berengar's breath on her ivory ear, the girl quickly jumped out of her seat and gazed at Berengar like a frightened rabbit in front of a big bad wolf. Seeing the defensive look on her face was outright adorable, and as such, Berengar merely shook his head before responding to the girl. "I am only joking, Valeria, you do not need to be so terrified. Sit, enjoy some food and wine." Hearing this, Honoria began to settle her racing heart and sat in her chair while Berengar and Lind sat beside one another at the head of the table. Eventually, Henrietta arrived and sat in her spot as well. Thus Berengar drank from his skull chalice once more. After taking a sip, he exhaled heavily before peeking over at Honoria, who still seemed to be a bit flushed from the passionate display he had shown her with Lind. Thus he used this opportunity to inform the girl of the upcoming events. "Valeria, the sailor I have hired to teach you will arrive in Kufstein tomorrow. It would be best to awaken bright and early to receive your training. I do not want my kindness to go to waste." After hearing this, Honoria's appearance began to return to normal, and she nodded her head slowly and silently. It had taken some time for her to get accustomed to the sight of Berengar and Lind kissing passionately in the open. Despite being inexperienced, She knew enough to understand what Berengar and Lind had gotten up to after leaving her behind. In a way, she felt defeated by Lind once more. Though she was interested in Berengar, it was not until she saw him locked in another young woman's embrace that she began to understand her feelings for the man. Inside her heart was a mix of emotions she was trying to work through, and as such, she merely ate her meal in silence while the other 3 members sitting at the table discussed various topics. She began to ponder the possibility that the reason she was jealous of the attention that Berengar showed Lind was that she had fallen for the man. After eating her meal, Honoria returned to her room, where she prepared herself for sleep. While waiting for her weariness to overtake her, she had thought long and hard about what complex emotions she had felt throughout the day. Chapter 256 Honoria's Request. Today was the day that the sailing instructor from Venice had arrived in Kufstein to teach Honoria how to sail. Honoria had awoken bright and early to begin her instruction and had not taken Berengar's kindness for granted. She was currently learning to sail a caravel, a simple sailing vessel used by most nations in the Mediterranean. Berengar had already purchased a few of these vessels for teaching his naval draftees how to sail, and as such, he had more than one available for her to train with. Today was a special day for Honoria. Berengar took the day off from work to observe her progress and see if she was using the time and resources he had given her wisely. To his surprise, she was already partially knowledgeable in the art of sailing. Even though her instructor was not pleased with teaching a woman how to sail, he never complained. After all, he was being paid an absurd amount of money to teach this young maiden to sail. Instead, he did his best to equip Honoria with the knowledge necessary to do such a thing as such. Berengar stood next to Heraclius, who was perched on a post next to him, as the 2 of them observed Honoria's actions. The pretty smile on her face was one of genuine happiness as she began to rig the sails as instructed. Seeing this, Berengar and Heraclius both looked at each other before gazing back upon Honoria. The moment their eyes made contact, there was a slight nod of their heads, as if they were thinking the same thing. Which was, "This girl is too precious." After sailing down the Danube for a bit and back to Kufstein, Berengar, Honoria, and Heraclius departed the vessel where Berengar handed the instructor a sack filled with silver coins before thanking the man. "Thank you for this. I know about your reservations, but you have helped me a lot." The man quickly snatched the pouch from Berengar's hands, where he began to count the coins to ensure the proper amount that was agreed to was still there. After doing so, he spat in the river before addressing Berengar's statement. "I don't like it. A pretty young thing from her should not be sailing, she should be at home making babies. However, you are the Duke of Austria, and if this is what you like to do with your playthings, far be it from me to complain." Hearing this, Berengar merely scoffed. He could not care less what this sailor thought of him. He was simply a means to an end. After confirming the payment, the sailor departed to the city of Kufstein for the day. Like every night, he would spend the silver he gained from Berengar on wine and wenches. As for Berengar, he escorted Honoria back to the castle as he began to ask her about her day. "I see you are not wasting my charity, that is good. Tell me, now that you have some experience sailing, how do you feel about it?" Honoria thought about Berengar's questions for a few moments before responding with a bitter smile. "I enjoy it, however, something feels off. It is not like when I was sailing with Agnellis." Berengar thought about this for a few moments as he began to address her concerns. "I can think of 2 potential reasons for that. First, you have feelings for Agnellis, and you were more interested in spending time with Agnellis than you were sailing." Hearing this, Honoria began to laugh at Berengar's speculation before teasing him. "Why, Duke Berengar, are you perhaps jealous of my relationship with Agnellis?" To this, Berengar scoffed before replying, "You greatly overestimate your importance." When Honoria heard this, she instantly pouted, and the 2 walked in awkward silence for a while. After they had walked for a few minutes, she asked Berengar about the second possibility he had mentioned. "What was your second idea?" Berengar seemed to be knowledgeable and worldly. As such, Honoria highly valued his opinion. After hearing the princess's question, Berengar scratched his chin for a few moments before saying the second thought he had on her reasoning for not enjoying sailing as much as she used to. "The second reason could be that the thing you loved most about sailing was the freedom you experienced, and because I have you in a controlled setting as you learn how to sail, you feel as if that liberty you once felt is missing." The moment Berengar said this, Honoria's eyes flashed, and she looked at Berengar with a complicated expression. After doing so, she smiled bitterly and revealed some of her past to Berengar, completely forgetting her cover story as she did so. You are right, growing up, I was never allowed to leave the palace. My father was strict and overprotective and did not even allow me to associate with other nobles my age. Though he doted on me for the most part, the reality is that the only company I had was my siblings, and they all treated me like a doll in a glass house. I used to gaze down from my window into the harbor every night as the sun began to set, imagining what life would be like if I were just to run away and hop on a ship sailing to parts unknown. Going on a grand adventure, discovering new lands, and meeting new people. When my father tried to marry me off to the various princes, I was too shy to talk with them. Of course, I was too proud to admit that and merely told myself that they were too lazy, skinny, fat, ugly, unambitious, drunk, or any other excuse I could think of to justify in my mind that I was too good for them. As such, I rejected every suitor ever brought to me, resulting in me being betrothed to the worst of them all. Hearing the girl's story, Berengar was fully convinced that she was Princess Honoria, as her background was the same as what he knew about the princess from the Eastern Empire. Not only that, but she had used a term like palace to describe her family home instead of villa, which was an obvious indicator of her real identity. However, Berengar did not spoil the moment and merely decided to pet the girl on the head and comfort her. This caused Honoria to look up at Berengar in shock, where she saw his charming smile before he said the words. I am sorry you had to go through that, it must have been terrible. I too know what it is like to live a life of loneliness, without a single friend to call my own. Berengar was genuine when he said this. In his past life, he had spent most of it alone. Both of his parents worked all day, and he was forced to endure a life of solitude in an empty house. When he was at school, he was always reading some books, thus causing the other kids to ignore him often. From the day he was born until he died, he did not have a true friend, merely a string of acquaintances that came and went from his life as time passed. At one point, he, too, had put on a confident facade. In doing so, he convinced himself that he was better than everyone else and that no woman was good enough for him. Because of this, he could partially understand Honoria's feelings about her lonely past, as he experienced a similar childhood. Hearing Berengar expresses his sympathy as a kindred soul, a tear began to form in Honoria's eye, which Berengar quickly wiped away with his finger and grabbed a hold of the girl, forcing her into his embrace as he stroked her silky white hair while speaking words of comfort. Don't cry. You have something that I never had. Honoria began to sniffle as she looked up at Berengar's gleaming sapphire eyes with curiosity in her minty orbs before asking Berengar what he meant. What's that? Berengar then glanced up at Heraclius, who was flying in the sky above, watching over his master like a guardian angel. While doing so, Berengar spoke his words. You have a loyal companion in Heraclius. At the very least, that gives you an advantage I never had. Hearing this, Honoria began to break out in laughter. It was true. She was incredibly blessed to have such an intelligent and caring pet. The more she laughed, the more her sorrow in her heart began to fade until finally there was silence. After two stopped outside the castle's gates, Honoria looked back at Berengar with a gentle smile on her face before making a request of him. Promise me something, will you? Upon hearing this, Berengar merely smiled and nodded his head before responding, not expecting it to be anything serious. Sure, what is it? After getting Berengar's assurance, Honoria spoke her conscience. When you next find yourself troubled by your lonesome past, seek me out, and talk to me about it. In return, I promise to tell you everything there is to know about me. Berengar was stunned about this. However, before he could respond to Honoria's request, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him on the cheek. As she did so, her cheeks began to flush as she boldly announced her feelings. I think I am starting to fall for you. With that, Honoria ran off into the castle, too embarrassed to face Berengar any longer. Berengar merely stood in the doorway to his castle while stunned, utterly unaware that Lind had seen the entire display from the tower above the courtyard with a frown on her face. Chapter 257 Legal Reforms. After getting a good night's sleep, Berengar awoke the next day, and after having his morning tea, he immediately thrust himself into his work. For starters, he had begun to refine the legal system of the Duchy of Austria. Berengar was of the mindset that crime could not be tolerated, whether from the perspective of the law or within a community. To Berengar, The level of crime that existed within a community was whatever the people within it were willing to tolerate. He planned to expand legal reforms and included propaganda to inspire communities to report crimes to their nearest official. As such, he was in the process of designing comprehensive legal reforms. Though crime in itself was rare in Tyrol and especially within the city of Kufstein, it had begun to become widespread throughout much of Austria, and not just minor offenses either. The devastation caused in the wake of the Bavarian occupation resulted in thousands of peasants fleeing to the city's sanctuary. In their desperation, these peasants turned to crime to survive, which in turn led to the creations of criminal syndicates that had begun to pop up across the more impoverished regions of Austria. Because of this, Berengar had started his legal reforms with strict countermeasures to organized crime. Any person convicted of a crime who was determined to be associated with a criminal syndicate recognized by the Department of Intelligence's Internal Service was to be sentenced to death by firing squad. The criminal syndicates were still in their infancy. Thus, they had yet to entrench themselves in the critical sectors of society. Berengar fully intended to root them out and destroy them from the roots to the stem. He refused to allow businesses and politics to tie themselves to criminal syndicates like in his previous life. Thus, even if someone committed a non-violent misdemeanor like fraud or theft, so long as they had ties to any known criminal syndicate, they would be sentenced to death. It was cruel, but Berengar had seen the rise of narco-states in his past life and desired to end such a possibility before it had a chance to become a reality. Gangsters were the first among the people who would be sentenced to death under this new system. Other heinous crimes such as murder, kidnapping, and rape were also deemed worthy of such a punishment. As for child molesters, Berengar had a special hell intentionally designed for them. They would be castrated and then sentenced to indentured servitude. They would engage in hard labor for the remainder of their miserable existence. If they dropped dead from overexhaustion, Berengar did not care. That was just one less mouth to feed. To make his stance clear, a strict federal age of consent was applied at the age of 16. Any adult caught having sexual relations with a minor would be tried as a child molester, and if convicted, sentenced to the punishment mentioned above. Every other violent crime had a sentence varying from 3 years to life in prison, depending on the severity of the crime. Berengar intended to construct labor camps to act as the prisons in his society. The convicted criminals would pay off their debt to society with physical labor, usually in the form of dangerous jobs that provided significant risks to the civilian population or monumental projects like canals and road building. There was a 3-strike rule in place for this system when it came to felonies of all kinds. If convicted 3 times of a felony, they would be sentenced to death, just like the gangsters, murderers, kidnappers, and rapists. In this court system, if one were sentenced to death, they would be allowed a single appeal to the courts. In doing so, the crime would be reinvestigated, and if the criminal were found innocent of the crime, they would be released from their sentence. However, if determined guilty after a single appeal, they would immediately be executed by firing squad. Berengar had seen taxpayers' money wasted on keeping criminals who were clearly guilty but awaiting their 7th appeal alive during his past life. To him, a second chance at a trial was fair enough. After that, if they were still determined to be guilty, there was no point keeping such monsters alive. It was an absolute waste of resources. For Berengar, mismanagement of the finite resources on this earth was a grave sin, and he had no desire to provide food and water to a criminal while it could be given to a starving child instead. As for nonviolent crime, it would entirely depend on the crime that had been committed. For example, if one were to be convicted of theft, they would lose the hand they used to steal the item. Others included imprisonment for a limited duration, assuming they survived the backbreaking work given to prisoners. They would either fear going back to such a hell or become a repeat offender, thus adding to their 3 strikes. Anyone convicted of a felony was illegible to vote in the future. As such, they were also losing their say in how society was run, assuming they met the qualifications to be a member of the electorate in the first place. Though the system was harsh, it also had its fair points. For example, it was based on the American principle of innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proving guilt fell upon the prosecutor. The determination of guilt was left up to a jury of the suspect's peers. Berengar also declared the need for public defenders and the need to pay these public defenders well so that it is considered a desirable position by talented lawyers. Like all of the other reforms Berengar had begun to make, a date is set for transition, which was 25 years. This date could be renewed if there were not enough lawyers that existed to fulfill the needs of the criminal justice system. The law enforcement system would be partially based on the United States of America from Berengar's previous life. Small towns and villages would fall under the jurisdiction of sheriffs that were local to their community. There would also be state and federal agencies, including a dedicated department of border guards. Ensuring the migration of people into Austria was through a legal and safe manner. As for cities and larger towns would have dedicated police departments comprised of volunteers. These had to be Austrian citizens who did not possess a criminal background. They were authorized to use lethal force in self-defense and in scenarios where a perpetrator was fleeing the scene of their crime. Torturing criminals for a confession or intelligence was outlawed, so long as they were Austrian citizens. While advanced interrogation methods were legal to be used on foreign agents and criminals, the more barbaric practices were outlawed altogether. To outfit these upstanding men of the law, Berengar would supply them with breastplates, gorgets, burgonets, and revolving flintlock pistols. These pistols were rifled for greater accuracy and fired a smaller caliber variant of the mine ball for more significant effect. They also had a rifled flintlock cavalry carbine. This carbine could have a bayonet affixed if necessary. These officers would be trained in the skills needed to fulfill their duties to the best of their ability, including horseback riding. Unlike the Grand Army of Austria that wore black and gold Landsknecht attire beneath their armor, these police officers wore blue and black Landsknecht attire beneath their blackened steel cuirasses. NCOs and officers' armor was trimmed with a mirror polish that slightly resembled silver. The reason for this was twofold. Firstly, it was to protect the officers from potentially violent criminals. More importantly, it was established so that it was easy to distinguish law enforcement from military officials. Until now, Berengar's cities were garrisoned by military personnel who also acted as law enforcement agents. Because of this, there was a feeling of oppression in the air of many of the regions whose lords had previously rebelled against his rule. By establishing dedicated police forces from among the locals, he attempted to appease the masses by allowing them to be policed by their own people. Berengar had worked the budget around to fund all of this, and due to his business that would soon start production, Berengar knew he could easily afford it. He had to stamp out the new wave of crime as quickly and efficiently as possible. Until such law enforcement agencies could be drafted, the garrisons would have to fulfill their duties according to the new laws. Berengar did not need prisons, but labor? One could never have too much of that, as such dedicated prisons like those that existed in his past life would practically be non-existent in his state. However, detention centers for those awaiting trial would be constructed shortly. Compared to the medieval ideas of justice, this system was the fairest and most righteous treatment of suspects and criminals that anyone had ever imagined. Though many from Berengar's past life would label it as cruel and inhumane, it was a significant step forward in progress. Besides, those people did not exist in this world. As for those from the future of this timeline, hopefully, they would one day look back and be intelligent enough to realize that everything Berengar did was to modernize the medieval German world. Sometimes harsh methods were necessary to do so. Chapter 258 Venetian Response. Weeks had passed since Berengar had begun production on the first glass factory, and at the moment, it was partially functional. Using Agnellis's trade connections, Berengar had started selling the new crystal glass in limited quantities to the wealthy noblemen of the Byzantine Empire. His plan was simple: create a demand for his luxurious glass products and then increase production at a rate capable of overtaking Venetian business. The crystal glass had become extensively popular in the East after the first batch was sold at a high price. As Berengar eyed the Republic of Venice's glass monopoly, they too had begun to observe his actions, especially regarding the shipyards being constructed in the region known as Istria. The construction of 3 large shipyards far larger than the ones which Venice owned was of great concern to the Venetians. In response to this, the Venetian Doge sat in his office surrounded by members of his admiralty. These admirals were the greatest of his naval commanders, and they had gathered to discuss the potential rise of a Grand Austrian navy and the threat such a thing posed to Venice. One of the admirals stepped forward and immediately presented a sizable transparent glass bowl. This absurdly clear glass was shocking to the president, and he gazed upon it with wonder as he pondered where such a marvel had come from. The Doge was a position similar to that of President from the United States of America in Berengar's previous life. He was the de facto head of state for the Venetian Republic, which was a vassal state in this timeline of the Kingdom of Italy. With the unification of Italy in this timeline and their current monarch being the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the Venetian Republic and the Genoans were allowed certain autonomy in regards to how their local governments functioned. If anything, they were closer to protectorates than they were to vassals. The Venetian Doge was shocked when he saw such high-quality, transparent glass and began to question his eyes. Is this glass? Who created such a masterpiece? Without hesitation, the admiral responded to the Doge's statement with a frown on his face. That would be the Austrians. While the Doge initially smiled, his face immediately turned sour when he heard this news. This immaculate crystal glass was a threat to Venetian dominance of the market, and as such he had to make sure his ears were not lying to him. Are you telling me that bastard Berengar has created such pristine glassware? Does he seek to seize our monopoly on the glass trade? The admirals looked at each other silently before the head admiral placed a document on the Doge's desk with a grim look in his eye before summarizing its contents. That is not all. There are reports that he is building 3 shipyards, far more significant than our own. We can't even fathom what kind of monstrous vessels he seeks to create within them, but needless to say, it does not bode well for us. If Berengar seeks to challenge not only our monopoly on the glass trade but also our authority on the sea, then we cannot simply stand by and allow him to build a navy capable of competing with us. Something must be done. After hearing the head admiral's concerns, the Doge nodded his head. However, he was not as concerned as the admirals, for how could Berengar challenge their might? They had hundreds of naval vessels, some of them were even armed with bronze cannons. It would take years for Berengar to build a navy capable of challenging the Venetian Republic, or so he believed. As such, he was much calmer than the men gathered in his room. I understand your concerns. However, we can't just take action against the Austrians. Our navy might be superior to theirs, but their army could easily invade our lands and cause us serious trouble. We should wait and observe. At least until we know what kinds of ships Berengar is manufacturing, there is no way he will be able to compete with us. It will take him years to build enough ships to challenge our authority. Even if he were to somehow use the methods we have achieved to rapidly produce vessels. It is not something to be worried about. We can always declare war on him and sink his ships before he can produce enough to be a threat. For now, we should focus on building our army and strengthening our ties with the Emperor. If all of Italy unites behind us, there is no way for Berengar to defeat us in a war. For now, we should bribe pirates to seize the glass he seeks to sell across the Mediterranean. Hearing this, the naval officers gathered had awkward expressions on their faces, which spurred the Doge to question their glances. What is it? Is there something I am missing? One of the admirals who was standing at attention immediately presented his report. It would appear that Berengar is currently trading what little glassware he has produced so far to the Byzantines, using their merchants' vessels. If it were revealed that we were sponsoring pirates to rob Byzantine ships, it could ignite a conflict with the empire to the east. When the Doge of Venice heard this, his expression sank. Even if it was a slight possibility, they could not risk a war with the Byzantines. After all, that was one of their most significant trading partners. As such, he was left at a loss in how to handle the scenario he was facing. This crystal glass was infinitely superior to the quality of glass they produced in Venice and could quite easily put them out of the glass business, which was one of their biggest trades. The blow to their economy that such a thing could cause would be disastrous. Berengar had risen to power too quickly for anyone to predict what he was fully capable of accurately. It seemed like every time the man's name was mentioned, he had either achieved another overwhelming victory in warfare or invented something new that was worth a fortune. To many observers, the rise of Austria as the preeminent German state was a certainty. However, if they were allowed to possess a powerful navy and merchant fleet on top of their overwhelming army, then they were destined to rise to a status that could rival the greatest kingdoms and empires within Europe and the Mediterranean. Such a thing could not be allowed, especially since Austria had become the heart of the German Reformation. As such, the Doge of Venice came up with only one solution to halt the progress of Austria. Contact the Pope, and offer him our unlimited support in his upcoming crusade against the Berengar heresy. Berengar von Kufstein must die. Since infiltrating Kufstein and assassinating Berengar was not an option due to Berengar's effective counter-espionage network, the only solution was to throw the weight of the Catholic world against him and pray that he fell. As such, the Admiralty saluted as they announced their support for the Venetian Doge's decision. Yes, your serenity. With this, all admirals except for one, the head admiral, had left the building and begun to prepare for the upcoming conflict. The admiral who remained looked at the Doge with a grim expression on his face before asking the question on his mind. I hear he has cannons capable of launching explosive projectiles. Do you think he will mount such fearsome weapons on his vessels? In response to this, the Doge was silent. The confident facade he had shown the other admirals instantly crumbled. As such, he reached for a glass out of his cabinet and began to pour the wine. This glass had a deep blue color and was not exactly the most transparent material. After pouring wine into the blue glass, the man handed it to his admiral before pouring another drink into the crystal glass Berengar had created. After carefully observing the Merlot liquid within the container, the Doge began to frown. He could quite easily see the deep red color of his wine, and this infuriated the man. After seething in rage for a few moments, the Doge finally answered the admiral's question. Without a doubt, I have no idea what kind of effect such mighty weapons will have on our ships, but it most certainly will be disastrous. Even if he manages to create a few dozen vessels armed with those weapons, it could cause us some trouble. Thus, in response to this threat, I want our armada expanded. I want a total of 1,000 naval vessels, each armed with a minimum of 4 guns created within the next 5 years. I don't care how you have to do it, just make it happen. To this, the admiral sighed. At the moment the Venetian navy had between 300 and 400 ships. If they were to gain a total of 1,000 in 5 years, they would have to produce over 600 ships in that time. It was simply outrageous, yet he would try his best. As such, he responded by saluting the Doge. Yes, your serenity. After doing so, the Doge merely sneered before uttering his next word. Dismissed. Afterward, the admiral left the office of the Doge, where the man was left to his lonesome. He quickly downed the contents of his glass before swiping it off his desk in a fit of rage, shattering the perfect piece into thousands of tiny shards. After doing so, the Doge began to curse in the air. Make no mistake, Duke Berengar von Kufstein. I will make you regret sticking your nose in my business. Chapter 259, 14th Birthday. Weeks had passed, and finally, Adela's birthday was nearing the corner. As such, Berengar had already left the castle in Kufstein. Much to his surprise, Lind was invited to come with him. He supposed his 2 women were beginning to get along, which was a good sign. He had no idea that the reason for this was because the 2 women had conspired behind his back to meet up and convince him together to end his newly formed relationship with Honoria. As such, he was in a good mood as he sat in his carriage, which drew him closer to Graz, with his arm wrapped around his lover, holding her tightly. Lind was frowning heavily at the moment. Despite the affection Berengar was showing her, there was an unwanted person in this carriage, and it was not Henrietta. Though the little girl was also present, the person who had so thoroughly ruined the mood was none other than Honoria. To be frank, Berengar did not trust the girl by her lonesome. She was a spoiled, entitled brat, and though he was beginning to take measures to correct this behavior, he had ultimately decided to take her with him to Adela's birthday, rather than allow her to cause trouble in Kufstein while he was absent. Even though Honoria had apologized for her rude behavior, Lind was still unhappy with the girl's presence. Though she was aware that Berengar's intentions for the girl mainly were political at this point, she was still worried that Berengar might fall for the young, naive princess. Thus there was an awkward silence in the carriage as Berengar and his companions waited to arrive in Graz. After most of the day had passed, the caravan finally arrived in Graz, and they were not the only visitors. Count Otto held an esteemed position in Berengar's government. He was on the Duke's council and, as count, was the de facto governor of Steiermark. This was thanks to his daughter, Adela, who was Berengar's fiancée. However, Otto had made a name for himself in Berengar's campaign against the Bavarian occupation and, as such, was held in high esteem by the other counts. As Berengar and his carriage entered the castle's courtyard, they were greeted by Count Otto and his family. Berengar was the first to step out of the carriage, followed by Lind, then Henrietta, and finally Honoria. Adela needed one glance to tell that this beautiful young girl was her competition and highly likely to be Princess Honoria. Ava, who was well aware of Adela's grievance, had a wide smirk on her face. She could tell instantly that the girl harbored feelings for Berengar by the way she glanced at him. Count Otto also noticed this and felt slighted. Berengar had not just brought his lover but another young woman to his fiancée's birthday celebration. Regardless of this, Berniger approached the Count and greeted him. "Uncle, it is good to see that you are still in such good health." Count Otto merely nodded, his gaze never shifting from Honoria's presence. Henrietta, on the other hand, sheepishly greeted her uncle. "Uncle." The little girl hid behind Berengar as she said this. She was shy by nature, and though she had begun to make friends, often at the expense of her brother's reputation, she was still nervous around unfamiliar people. After all, Count Otto was seldom a part of her life. Finally, Count Otto could not contain his curiosity and asked the question on his mind. Who might this beautiful young woman be? To this, Berengar glanced over at Honoria before returning his gaze to his uncle. He smiled while answering his question. "This is Lady Valeria. She is from the Byzantine Empire and is a guest at my court for the time being. I did not trust her to behave herself by her lonesome in Kufstein, so I brought her along with me." This was the truth of the matter, but for some reason, Count Otto expected there to be more to their relationship than this. As for Honoria, she pouted when she heard this. She was not necessarily a troublemaker, aside from getting on Linda's nerves for the fun of it. However, after being threatened with removal from Berengar's court, she had halted such actions in fear that Berengar would go through with his threat and ship her back to the Byzantine Empire. As such, she had been behaving herself for the last few days. Honoria greeted Count Otto by bowing respectfully. "I thank you for your hospitality, Count Otto." To this, Otto merely nodded before shifting his attention back to Berengar. "Welcome to my home, Your Grace. I trust that my daughter's birthday celebration will be to your liking." Berengar nodded when he heard this and followed Count Otto and his family inside. While doing so, he approached his little fiancée and grabbed a hold of her hand. However, to this, she merely ripped it away from his grasp and pouted. She was already displeased that Berengar had taken a liking to yet another girl, yet he had the gall to bring her to her birthday celebration? To this, Adela felt insulted. Seeing that his fiancée was upset, Berengar sighed heavily before expressing the thoughts on his mind. "You look beautiful, Adela. It has been some time since we last met. Did you miss me?" Adela pouted in silence, not bothering to speak with Berengar. After seeing both Lind and Honoria clinging onto her fiancé, Adela had grown quite self-conscious. Not only in regards to her position in Berengar's life but also in terms of her appearance. Though she was still growing, she felt as if her charm did not match that of an exotic princess from the east like Honoria, nor did it match the sex appeal of a buxom beauty like Lind. As such, she simply sulked for the time being. Eventually, Berengar was led to his quarters, where Lind was separated and given her room. It would be disrespectful to Count Otto and his daughter for Berengar to have carnal relations with his lover while under their roof. After a while, Lind regrouped with Adela and hugged the girl before stuffing her into her bust, nearly suffocating the girl in the process as she stroked Adela's golden hair. "Oh sweet little Adela, I understand how you feel. If you need to cry, let it all out. I am here for you." An unlikely alliance had formed between Lind and Adela, who were usually at each other's throats. For the time being, they were united against Honoria in this awkward trio that had been formed around the man they loved. As women, they naturally needed comfort when they were upset. Thus they provided it for one another. Adela began to break down in tears as she tried to break free of Linda's large bust and sobbed heavily while expressing her thoughts. "I didn't expect him to bring the girl here. I am so envious." To this, Lind sighed as she tried to comfort Adela. "Berengar doesn't love the girl, at least not yet. He sees her as a political tool to be used against those he deems his enemies. For whatever reason, he is confident he will be fighting France in the future and wants to do everything in his power to break the alliance between them and the Byzantine Empire. Besides, now more than ever, he needs a powerful ally, and as such, he will likely enact polygamy to marry the three of us. Despite this, he wants to make you empress, so that should show you how much he cares for you and your position as first among his future wives." Upon hearing this, Adela began to wipe the tears from her eyes as she slowly sniffled. After she had calmed herself down, she questioned the legitimacy of what Lind had just said. Really? Adela did not know how to feel about this. Her worries about her spot as the wife being taken had become realized, in the sense that Berengar intended to become a polygamous monarch, but she still held the position of his empress and first wife, which meant that Berengar still had feelings for her. Lind nodded her head and smiled as she stroked Adela's hair. To this, Adela replied with a bitter smile as she came to a sudden realization. There's no convincing him otherwise, is there? Upon hearing this, Linda's smile also turned bitter as she shook her head. Though the two had initially conspired to bring an end to Berengar's budding relationship with Honoria, Lind had realized during the time since then that Berengar would not be dissuaded because he knew that neither Lind nor Adela were willing to leave him over such an issue. Thus, instead of convincing Berengar otherwise, Lind decided to convince Adela that it was simply not worth the effort and that Berengar still considered her first among his women. After all, Lind had gotten what she wanted in all of this. She would one day be an official wife of Berengar, and that was enough for her. Seeing the look on Linda's face, Adela sighed before she broke away from Linda's grasp and expressed her acceptance of the predicament she found herself in. Fine, I accept it, but that does not mean I will not fight for his affection. Chapter 260 14th Birthday 2. While Lind and Adela were comforting each other, Berengar was preparing for the upcoming celebration. The gift he had gotten Adela was a white Arabian stallion. It was quite costly to obtain, but it was well worth the price. While he was making sure the gift was ready for its new master, Honoria played with Heraclius, who she had brought along for the journey. The mighty eagle flew outside the courtyard where Honoria played about, waiting for the celebration to begin. As such, the day passed before the guests had fully gathered, and night had begun to descend upon the city of Graz. As it did so, the various nobles of Austria gathered for the birthday celebration of the future Duchess of Austria. Berengar was flanked on all sides by three beautiful women as he stood at the center of attention. Adela was latched onto Berengar's right arm, while Lind was clutching the left in between her mighty bosom. Honoria was behind him slung around his shoulder. The three girls were greatly intoxicated by the drinks provided at the party, and as such, they openly fought for Berengar's attention. Though many of the men envied Berengar for the love of three beautiful young women, he was having a hard time maintaining his composure. The three girls began to fight among themselves over his affection the moment the alcohol had entered their bloodstream, thus he was trying his best not to chastise them for their unruly behavior. Adela put on doll-like expressions as she began to rest her head onto Berengar's chest. Her face was flushed red from the wine she had drunk, and she began to speak slowly. Berengar, I can't wait for our wedding. To this, Berengar petted the girl's silky golden hair before nodding his head silently. He felt like if any words escaped his lips, he would not maintain the calm facade he had created. These three girls were clinging to him like cats to catnip, and he was not even able to drink away his discomfort. Count Otto merely laughed as he drank with his wife Wanda. Though he was initially unsure about Berengar's little harem, he now felt great joy watching the young duke's displeasure. It was undeniable that he was not happy with it the way the girls were behaving. As such, Otto merely sighed before addressing the curious sight. Well, all I can say is His Grace brought this upon himself. He should not have been so greedy. To this, Wanda smiled. Seeing her husband in such a good mood about the awkward scenario displaying itself was a good sign. It was so uncomfortable that none of the nearby nobles approached Berengar or the girls and maintained their distance while commenting among themselves. Lind forced Berengar's hands onto her breasts as she boldly displayed her feelings. When she was intoxicated, it was common for her to forget her manners and act on impulse. Darling, I missed you in bed last night. Maybe tonight we can have some fun? Berengar immediately withdrew his hand and looked away. When he did so, he noticed that Adela was pouting. Like usual, the girl could not handle Linda's suggestive comments. One could tell by looking at her that she was incredibly envious. Of course, what came next shocked Berengar. He felt a slight nibble on his neck, and when he went to address it, he noticed that Honoria had sunk her teeth into him ever so slightly out of jealousy. Even though it was harmless, Berengar would not tolerate such violent action, and as such, he quickly shoved Honoria off of him and flicked her on the nose. Behave yourself, Missy, or I swear to God I will drag you back to Kufstein myself and put you on the first boat back to the Empire. Seeing Honoria scolded so fiercely, the other two girls began to laugh at her misfortune, and Berengar felt degraded. Though he was not the slightest bit embarrassed, he had since grown used to such large social gatherings and was accustomed to the way people stared at him. Honoria, of course, began to pout, and her adorable face as she did so caused many young men in the audience to clench their fists with envy. The three most beautiful women in the room were all clinging to one man, openly displaying their affection for him. It was enough to drive any sane man insane, yet Berengar calmly reacted to this before deciding he had enough of the girls and their actions. Thus he clanged his glass before making an announcement. I have an announcement to make, though I wanted this to be later in the night. I figured now is as good enough time as any. I will show off the splendid gift that I have gotten my future wife for her 14th birthday. After saying this, the servants left the room before shortly returning while leading a solid white Arabian stallion by the reins. Its saddle was made of the finest black leather and the blanket of the finest silk. The metallic components were made of gold, and it contrasted with the white fur of the mighty beast perfectly. Upon seeing this, Adela nearly lost control of the crystal glass in her hand provided by Berengar. However, she maintained a firm grip and merely covered her gaping mouth with her free hand. After doing so, she ran up to the horse and began to pet it while staring deep into its dark eyes. The moment the rider and horse met their eyes together, they knew that fate had bound them together. As such, Adela hugged the horse before deciding on a name for it. I will call you Siegfried, after the dragon slayer. Hearing this, Berengar smiled. Adela seemed to have a similar naming convention to him. After playing around with the horse for a while, Adela jumped into Berengar's arms and pecked him on the lips as a token of her gratitude. Thank you, Berengar. I love him. Berengar merely took a drink from the glass of wine he had procured while Adela was playing with her horse and smiled before making a joke. Hopefully not as much as me, right? In response to this, Adela merely smiled and stayed in silence. Afterward, the horse was led out of the great hall and back to its stables, where it would be resting from then on. Berengar, on the other hand, began to chat with Lind while the rest of the gifts were brought in. Adela revealed their contents like a kid on Christmas and thanked everyone for their support. However, nothing triumphed the mighty stallion from the east that Berengar had procured for his little fiancé. After Adela had opened her presents, she found a way to sneak off with Berengar to the balcony, where the two began to talk alone. Berengar sighed heavily as he drank from his glass, waiting for Adela to ask the question on her mind. After a few more sips of wine, Adela finally managed to get the courage to ask her future husband about her concerns. Do you love her? To this, Berengar made a snide remark. Which one? Adela began to pout once more as Berengar was being purposely obtuse. She did not want to ask the question outright. Nevertheless, Berengar forced her to say it. Honoria. When Berengar heard this, he nearly spat out his drink. However, he managed to choke it down and regained his composure before responding to Adela. Lind told you, did she? It only took Berengar a moment to figure out that Lind was responsible for Adela knowing the truth behind Honoria's identity. As such, he placed down his glass and looked off into the full moon in the sky above before answering honestly. At the moment, no, at least not to any severe extent. I will admit that I find her attractive, and sometimes she can be charming. That is when she isn't acting like a spoiled brat. What is important is that she has already begun to fall for me. I have no intentions to rush a relationship with our little runaway princess. I will take things slow and build a relationship with her step by step. After all, she has a part to play in my grand ambitions. Whether she finds her way into my heart as anything more than a passing fancy is up to her efforts to improve herself. Regardless of how I feel about her, that does not change what I have to do. An alliance with the Empire is too valuable to give up over personal feelings or a lack of them. While she was hearing this, Adela sighed before grabbing a hold of Berengar's hand and holding onto it firmly. After doing so, she looked him in the eyes with a solemn gaze before announcing the words she had in her heart. Even if you become a polygamous scoundrel, I will support you until the end. Just promise me that I will be your first wife and that you will never leave me. Seeing the sincere gaze that Adela was giving him, Berengar grabbed a hold of her and dragged the girl into his embrace before wiping a tear from her eyes. As he did so, he whispered in Adela's little ear, I swear on my life that I will never leave you. With that said, Berengar kissed the girl on the lips before releasing his hold over her. After doing so, he lifted his glass of wine and drank its remaining contents. The remainder of the night was spent in celebration, and Berengar would depart for his territory within the next day after all the work of a duke was never finished. Chapter 261 The War in Bohemia begins. 3 months had passed since Adela's 14th birthday, while Berengar was within Kufstein overseeing the reconstruction of Austria after the devastation wrought upon it by Bavarian occupation. The war for Bohemia had finally begun. After months of being supplied and trained by Austria and its industrial might, the Hussite forces had begun their attack on the Bohemian crown, which had fervently rejected their demands. Currently, the Hussites were split between two major factions, the moderates and the radicals. During Berengar's past life, the moderates had betrayed the radicals and ended the Hussite wars, causing the Catholic Church to achieve victory. In this timeline, Berengar had no intentions of supplying the moderates or sending advisors to them. A Hussite Bohemia would be a decent ally to have in his back pocket. Thus Berengar intended to aid them in any way he could short of full-scale military intervention. That is unless it was completely necessary. Eckhard and a group of Berengar's officers were standing alongside the sub-faction of the radicals known as the Kasparians. The Kasparians did not exist in Berengar's previous life. Still, in this timeline, they had become a powerful force with Berengar's aid and had already won a total of 3 battles since the war had begun. The leader of the Kasparian sect was a nobleman by the name of Alexei Kaspar. The man was young, a few years older than Berengar but not by many. He was also handsome and charismatic, and it was these qualities that helped him gain the favor of so many other noblemen and knights to support his cause. Currently, the man was dressed in a complete set of plate armor, with the Kasparian banner draped over his torso in the form of a tabard. He was pointing at a map stretched out upon the table. Tiny figures were in place to represent the various armies of the ongoing conflict. Eckhard was standing nearby. He was dressed in a set of brigandine and plate armor. The reason for this was simple: to avoid a diplomatic crisis, Berengar had openly taken a neutral stance in the Hussite wars. Due to how noticeable his nation's arms and armor were, it would be unwise for his military advisors to walk around in the equipment of the Grand Army of Austria. Thus they wore the attire afforded to average Hussite men at arms. Only the officers of the armies they supported knew that these men were a means of Austrian support. As Alexei spoke about his battle plan, Eckhard slowly watched while scratching his gray beard. "We will use our wagon forts to block the pass of the Catholic troops in this narrow valley. As they march upon our handgunners protected within the wagons, our cannons will rain fire upon them from above. A spear wall will protect the wagon forts. Once the enemy has engaged our defensive line, we will encircle them with our cavalry and clash against them on both sides, ensuring our victory." Though the Hussites had been victorious so far, the reality was that Berengar fully intended for this war to take years. The reason for this was twofold. For starters, the conflict in Bohemia diverted the Church's attention from Austria, buying Berengar time to not only expand his grand army but establish a grand navy as well. Secondly, the longer the Hussites fought, the more in debt they would be to Berengar. When the war was finally over, Berengar wanted the Hussites to be so indebted to him that they would be forced to cede the Sudetenland to Austria as payment. Thus Eckhard did not offer any advice to the current plan, as it was good enough to ensure victory against the Catholic armies. Instead, he merely observed the map of Bohemia, which had been divided up into Hussite-controlled territories and Catholic-occupied regions. The Sudetenland was under Hussite control. The reason for this was quite simple. These lands were predominantly German in linguistic, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. Because they were so close to Austria and were German themselves, they had been influenced by the German Reformation that Berengar and Ludolf had started. Thus, when the war broke out, they immediately threw in their support to the Hussite factions, as the Hussites were in many ways similar to the teachings of the German Reformation. As for the rest of the Bohemian lands, they were still largely under the control of the Bohemian crown and their Catholic supporters. Noticing that Ludolf was quietly observing the map, Alexei quickly voiced his concerns to the Austrian field marshal. "Marshal von Hallstatt, what do you think of the strategy as it has been presented?" To this, Eckhard looked around at the various Hussite knights and noblemen who had gathered and gave a nod of approval. "It should work just fine. I have nothing to add at the moment." Though Eckhard and his officers had assisted in training, tactics, and strategy, lately, they had taken a more background role and allowed the Hussites to proceed on their own. Alexei thought it meant that they would soon no longer be needed. He had no way of knowing that it was part of Berengar's plan to extend the conflict. As such, the young commander smiled and nodded his head. Hearing Eckhard's approval of the plan brought him great joy. If Eckhard was appointed as the highest commander of Berengar's forces, then Alexei believed he must be a capable man, and thus he highly valued the man's opinion. After observing the map for a while, Eckhard finally spotted an area that the Hussites were likely to lose, and as such, he walked over to the map and pointed his finger at the location. If the enemy is allowed to move unchecked in this region, they will conquer the lands held by the Taborites. It is necessary to send reinforcements to secure the region. I suggest sending a contingent of 2,500 men to assist our allies. Hearing this, Alexei nodded his head in agreement. Losing ground at this stage in the war would be detrimental to the cause. He moved two figures that represented 2,500 men into the region that Eckhard had pointed out. This left a finite number of men that the Kasparians could field to win the upcoming battle, but even then, the commander was confident in his ability to achieve victory. As such, Alexei asked for the opinion of men gathered at his strategy meeting. Does anybody else have any suggestions? After several moments of silence, Alexei sighed before giving his command. Dismissed. With that, everyone began to leave the command tent. As Eckhard departed, Alexei called out to him. If you don't mind, Marshal, I would like to have a word with you in private. Upon hearing this, Eckhard stopped in his tracks before turning around and facing the young commander with a stern expression on his lips. After glaring at the commander for a few moments, he asked the question on his mind. What can I help you with, Commander? Alexei poured 2 chalices of wine before he responded. He handed one of them to Eckhard before taking a drink from his goblet. Could you relay my request for further material support from His Grace, Duke Berengar von Kufstein? If we are to win this war, we will need more hand cannons and armor than are currently fielded. Hearing this, Eckhard smiled slightly before nodding his head. Of course, I am sure that His Grace will have no problems transporting more supplies into Kasparian lands. I will send a letter to him with haste. Is there anything else I can help you with? Alexei once more drank from his chalice before responding to Eckhard's question. An opinion would be nice. Upon hearing this, Eckhard decided to partake of the wine and took a small sip as he did so before responding. On what exactly? A solemn gaze filled Alexei's eyes as he spoke the thoughts on his mind. What are our chances of winning this war? Eckhard pondered for a few moments before expressing his opinion on the matter. With His Grace Berengar's support, 75%, though it will likely be a long and brutal conflict. Without such backing, your odds are significantly lower. If necessary, Berengar is likely to intervene in the war with his own army. Establishing a friendly state on his eastern border is critical for long-term stability. However, he would only do so if you and your allies fall into a state of total collapse. So I would not count on overt military support anytime soon. You can rest assured knowing that you are very likely to win this war with the help of our advisors and the supplies we give you. My advice is to be patient. Wars are not won overnight. Alexei reflected on this significantly and ultimately decided he would need some more time to consider his future. Thus he dismissed Eckhard with a single statement. I thank you for your advice, you can leave now. After hearing that, Eckhard saluted the man before departing from his tent. He still had plenty of things to do, and Austria's request for further support was at the top of his list. As such, he wrote a letter to Berengar on behalf of the Kasparians asking for additional material aid. This would be just one of many times the Hussites came begging Berengar for more support in their war. With each shipment of arms Berengar gave them, they would become indebted to Austria, and in doing so, fall further into Berengar's trap. Chapter 262 Battle at the Eastern Border. Months had passed, and while wars waged in Bohemia and North Africa, Eastern Europe was far from peaceful. Seeing that the Rus and the Golden Horde had begun to invade the Teutonic state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decided to avenge their loss at Grunwald and had joined the fray. After their defeat in Grunwald and the increase in the Teutonic state's power, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had unified into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decades earlier than in Berengar's previous life. The reason for this was simple: the Teutonic state was a growing threat, and by uniting their two countries they could gain an advantage against their common foe. As such, the Teutonic state found itself surrounded by hostile forces, all of them held considerable power. At the moment, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was considered one of the great powers of Eastern Europe. With the coalition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Golden Horde, and the various Rus states, the Teutonic Order was now facing an overwhelming threat. The order had already lost all of the territory gained from its war with the Grand Duchy of Moscow and had been forced back to their initial borders where they were currently holding the line against overwhelming odds. The choice to withdraw from the newly conquered regions and defend the heartland was not taken lightly by the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. He knew that his forces would be unable to keep a hold of the lands they had previously gained and thus opted to make a strategic withdrawal. He hoped to sue for peace with the other powers by giving up their gains in their previous war. Instead, Poland-Lithuania joined the war and was hellbent on the Teutonic state's destruction. At the moment, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order was standing on a castle's ramparts on the state's eastern border. In the field below was a coalition of forces waving the banners of their nations and individual feudal lands. The army was well over 50,000 strong, compared to the 10,000 defenders the Teutonic Order had managed to scramble together to defend the gateway into their territory. The man instantly cursed under his breath as he gazed upon the massive horde that had gathered outside the castle. Damn that fool, Simeon! If he were not obsessed with getting revenge on Berengar the Accursed, I wouldn't have lost so many troops in Oberstdorf. With those 10,000 men, this could have been prevented. The Teutonic state was on the precipice and besieged on all sides. Whether they would continue to survive as an independent state or face complete and total collapse was up to him. To this, the Grand Master merely sighed as he voiced the thoughts on his mind. The last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order? I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Luckily for him, none of the men beneath his command were around to hear his doubts. It would indeed harm morale if the word were to spread how doomed the Grand Master felt inside. The siege had yet to begin truly. Instead, the army had gathered outside the gates with the intent to intimidate the defenders behind its mighty walls. Of course, to an army of Catholic fanatics like the Teutonic Order, such a thing would never occur. Even if they had begun to fill their ranks with criminals to compensate for their losses, the indoctrination that occurred during initiation had completely brainwashed these criminals into soldiers of Christ, who feared no death. Thus, the intimidation tactics had not achieved the effect desired by the besieging forces. At the moment, the besieging troops were in the middle of constructing trebuchets in the field. These weapons would be used to bombard the castle for the foreseeable future. Of course, trebuchets were constructed below the walls by the Teutonic Order, and upon seeing the enemy siege weapons being constructed, the Grand Master yelled at his men below the ramparts. Prepare to fire into the enemy formation. I want those trebuchets knocked out before they can do some real damage. With this command, the siege had finally begun, and as such, the Teutonic Order instantly began loading the trebuchets with jars filled with pitch. These jars would be lighted before being tossed at the enemy trebuchets which were under construction. The hope was they could eliminate the enemy's siege weapons before they could be built appropriately. The numerous trebuchets within the castle began to toss their burning pitch jars over the walls and enemy formations. The first volley fired utterly missed their targets and instead landed on soldiers in the field, lighting them aflame and spreading the tar-like substance across their ranks. With this, the Grand Master lowered the visor on his helmet and ordered the archers to fire upon the enemy infantry. Knock, draw, loose. With these commands, a volley of thousands of arrows began to fill the sky and rain down on the opponents below, blocking out the sun as it did so, at least to some degree. Despite this, the attackers did not move their position. Most of them raised their shields, and others were directly affected by the volley. Arrows and bolts made their way into the bodies of dozens of men. Some of them died on the spot, others slowly fell to the ground and began to bleed out. Many were utterly unaffected as their armor had blocked the projectiles from achieving their goals. As arrows and bolts were launched on the coalition forces below, the attackers returned fire upon the Teutonic Order's soldiers and loosed their arrows upon the men stationed on the ramparts. It was significantly more difficult to hit an archer hiding behind a merlin than it was to rain arrows on opponents standing in the field. As such, the defenders were primarily protected by the castle's mighty walls as they continued to reap the lives of the enemy forces with their volley fire. While the arrows fell upon the attackers, the Teutonic Order had finished reloading the trebuchets and launched another volley at their targets. This time one of the pitch jars had landed on its target, and its flame instantly began to engulf the enemy trebuchet, which was nearing completion. Slowly but surely, the burning pitch began to turn the wooden siege device into ash. The engineers nearby who were unlucky enough to be covered in the flaming tar-like substance screamed in agony as the flames engulfed their bodies. Despite this, nobody moved to help them, and soon they fell to their deaths. Under the missile fire of the Teutonic Order, the general of the Golden Horde gave his order from atop his horse. "Raise the ladders." With that, men from all coalition nations began to rush towards the wall while carrying ladders with them. The intent was to scale the walls and fight the defenders atop the ramparts. While these ladders were moving into position, the Polish-Lithuanian commander gave his decree. "Release the battering ram." Upon hearing this, the Polish-Lithuanian forces in the vanguard immediately began pushing the battering ram into formation. The ram was wheeled and covered with fortifications to protect against missile fire. The heavily armored infantry used to push the device was relatively safe from the defenders' actions. However, when the battering ram finally got into position, the defenders immediately unleashed a cauldron of burning pitch onto the enemy below. Though the men operating the battering ram were directly protected from the substance, it slowly began to eat away at their covering. Eventually, the coalition soldiers were left without protection from the missile fire. More importantly, the next wave of the burning pitch left them roasted alive in their armor as the inflamed viscous substance coated them. When the Teutonic Grand Master gazed upon the sight of the enemy battering ram being destroyed, he smiled beneath his visor and yelled at the enemy, who could neither hear him nor understand him. "Enemies of God, I swear to the heavens that you will break your army taking this castle. Though I may die, I will enter the kingdom of heaven smiling knowing that the Teutonic state survives." When the defenders heard these words from their Grand Master, they were overtaken with zeal and roared the battle cry of all crusaders into the air as they fought for their very survival. "God wills it." The chant of the crusaders while they desperately defended their castle on their eastern border echoed into the air as the coalition forces attempted to break through the Teutonic Order's defenses. In doing so, the enemy forces fully understood the determination of the enemy they were facing and knew full well that this war would be a long and bloody one. This was merely the first day of the siege at the eastern border, and it would last for many more. The brave German soldiers of Christ held onto their territory, fighting and dying for their belief against an army they deemed to be heathens. The results of this battle would not be known to the world at large for some time. Ultimately, the Teutonic Order would be defeated, and their Grand Master killed in battle. The loss the Teutonic Order suffered at the eastern border would open the floodgates for the coalition to invade their lands. Within a year's time, the Teutonic state would find itself in shambles, barely holding on to what little land they had left. Chapter 263 Requesting Artillery. Months had passed since the Teutonic Order began its battle at the eastern border. On the other side of the world in Egypt, Arethes had pushed the Mamluks back to Alexandria. Seizing the city of Alexandria was of significant cultural importance to the Byzantine Empire. After losing it, the emperor had personally sent his most excellent general to reclaim it. The rest of the territory would have to follow the recapture of the ancient city. Arethes and his army were currently stuck outside the city of Alexandria. The siege had been going on for 2 weeks by now, and Arethes was starting to become impatient. What he needed was superior artillery. However, he was armed with a few small bronze cannons. Because of this, he could not regularly bombard the city. Instead, he had to maintain these cannons in fear that they might rupture from overload. Because of this, the siege was going much slower than it usually would. After his first battle with the Mamluks, Arethes realized the need for field artillery. After all, Berengar's forces had been largely successful because of this. As such, he desired to get his hands on some field guns and use them to bring down these walls. Since the first battle to recapture Egypt after centuries of being in the hands of other empires, Arethes had sent word back to Andronikos, who was living in Constantinople, ordering the man to travel to Kufstein and negotiate with Berengar for the purchase of cannons. Today Andronikos finally arrived within Kufstein, and as Berengar was eating breakfast with his family and guests, a servant approached him and whispered in his ear. After doing so, the man placed down his silverware and wiped his mouth with his napkin. Afterward, he stood up from the table abruptly and alerted Lind and Honoria as to the presence of the Byzantine envoy. "It would appear that Andronikos is here to discuss business. Lady Valeria, I do not want any confusion to occur from your presence, so I would humbly request that you sequester yourself in your room for the time being." Honoria quickly understood Berengar's intent. She had started to suspect that Berengar knew her identity, and as such, she nodded and smiled before departing. Of course, anything for you, your grace. With this, Honoria fled to her chambers and hid from the Byzantine envoy, though she did not know who Andronikos was, as she had never come into contact with Aretha's subordinates. She was aware of the difficulties if the envoy from the Empire learned that she was hiding in Kufstein under a false identity. After Honoria had vanished without a trace, Berengar ordered one of his servants to take her plate away and clean up the table. Get rid of Valerius' dishes, and make it seem like she was never here, and quickly. Hearing this, the servants immediately bussed Honoria's spot while Berengar entered the great hall, where the man named Andronikos was waiting patiently. As for Lind, she stayed in the dining hall with Henrietta and continued her meal. The moment Berengar saw the man, he opened his arms wide and approached the man, giving him a friendly hug. Andronikos, my friend, it has been some time since I last saw you. Tell me, what is so important that you must travel all this way to Kufstein? Andronikos accepted the friendly embrace before the two men distanced themselves from one another. After doing so, he informed Berengar of his reason for visiting. My friend, the last time we saw each other, you were merely a count, now you are a mighty duke. I am genuinely impressed with your growth. As for why I am here, the reason is strictly business. The Strategos wishes for me to negotiate the purchase of artillery. I know you won't sell us the magnificent guns you use in warfare, but indeed you can create something fitting for our empire to use against our enemies? Hearing this, Berengar scratched his chin for a few moments. If he wanted a powerful ally in the east, he would need to arm them with some form of artillery that was better than what was currently wielded by the feudal world. After thinking about it for a few moments, he got a brilliant idea, and as such, he clasped Andronikos' shoulder with a friendly smile on his face. I have a design in mind, but it has yet to be put into production. I promise you it will be more advanced than anything used by your enemies. However, these things are not easy to produce. I will need to set up an entirely new production line. For rapid transportation, I will need to establish it within a city closer to the empire. It will take me some time to accomplish this. The design Berengar had in mind was none other than the falconet, an early cannon design from the Renaissance that was used extensively by the European powers. It was slim, relatively lightweight, made of cast iron, and fired a 1-pound projectile. It was also capable of firing grapeshot if necessary, grapeshot being a far more primitive version of the canister shot that Berengar fired from his artillery. This would be an enormous benefit in field battles against the Empire's enemies. Still, if Berengar went to war with the Byzantines, it would prove to be entirely ineffective against his 12-pound cannons. With this, Berengar could advance his allies to the east and curry their favor. Andronikos was incredibly excited when he heard this news, and as such, he bowed respectfully to the young Duke of Austria. You have my gratitude. Tell me how much such weapons would cost. To this, Berengar began to act casually as he swiped his hand to the side. Think nothing of it. I understand you are in a bitter campaign to reclaim your lost territory. I will gift the first batch of cannons to you as a token of my friendship, and if you require more, I will provide as many as you need. As for their cost, you do not need to worry about such a thing. I am sure the wealth you gain from Egypt and Cyrene will be more than enough to cover the matter of debt you will owe me after your campaign is finished. If you so desire, we can outfit your troops with as many arquebuses, pikes, and armor they need to accomplish this objective as well, under the same conditions, of course. To the Empire, this could be considered an enormous favor. Though the Empire was wealthy, affording to outfit an army with new and modern equipment was a hefty price, something they could not easily do while engaged in a war with the Mamluk Sultanate. At most, they could buy a few batches at a time, but Berengar was offering to fully equip their army with modern equipment effectively for free, at least for the time being. When they finally won the campaign and gained the territories of Egypt and Cyrene, the Empire would be basking in more wealth than they had in the past 800 years. By then, they could quickly repay the debt they owed Berengar in one giant payment. It was an attractive offer, but Andronikos did not have the power to negotiate such a monumental decision. As such, he quickly began to address Berengar's recommendation. I will have to ask the higher-ups about this. I do not have the power to make such a decision. Berengar merely smiled and nodded as he heard this and responded in a friendly tone. I understand. Do convey my message to your superiors with haste. In the meantime, I will begin the construction of the production line and begin to produce the weapons. If you do refuse my kindness, we can always sell the cannons and equipment to you up front. Berengar's kind words held a hidden meaning. By saying they would be refusing his kindness, he was implying that it would harm diplomatic relations with Austria. After all, it would be seen as an insult by Berengar. This minor threat was laced into his otherwise kind words, and though Andronikos did not realize it, the emperor surely will when he heard these words. Though Berengar would make a vast sum trading these weapons to the Byzantines, he could care less about this. If the Byzantines were to accept his offer, there was only one thing Berniger would ask for as payment for their massive debt that would accumulate throughout their war with the Mamluk Sultanate, and that was Princess Honoria's hand in marriage. The desire for a swift victory in North Africa after decades of battling a stalemate with their enemies would hopefully be enough for Andronikos and Arethusa to convince the emperor to agree to Berengar's terms, and in doing so, they would fall straight into his trap. Berengar could consider the weapons and armor he provided to the Byzantine Empire's massive army as the dowry for Honoria, and the debt would be squared the moment they got married. To him, this was the perfect way to establish a long-term alliance with the Byzantine Empire while also cementing his dynasty's claim to the empire as a whole. More importantly, this would break the alliance between France and the Byzantine Empire. This was Berengar's true objective with his plans regarding Honoria. France was a neighbor that a united Germany was destined to clash with in the future. If Berengar did not wish to fight a two-front war, he would need to break the alliance the French had with the Byzantines. This was critical to his plans for the future. Germany had always suffered due to its geographical position as the center of Europe in his past life. Many wars had been lost because they were forced to fight on two fronts. By establishing an alliance with the great power in the east, Berengar could ensure his flank was secured to focus on his future enemies in the west. Thus, while Andronikos left the castle of Kufstein and began the long journey back to the empire, Berengar was smiling. If all went as planned, he would have dealt a significant blow to his future enemies without anyone even realizing it. Chapter 264 The Holy Maiden of France. Time flew by once more. Throughout the months, while Berengar was using the period of peace he had established in Austria to turn his duchy into a significant power, France found itself engulfed in war. For decades the English had been attempting to invade the Kingdom of France in a bid for control of the French throne. England has seized considerable gains within the past year, and with each passing day, more French land fell to the English invaders. When Aubry returned from the Byzantine Empire, he was sent off to war against the English by his father, King Giles de Valois. At the moment, the effeminate prince was clad from head to toe in steel-plate armor. Unlike in Austria where steel was a shared resource, in France, it was a rare commodity, and to outfit a man in a full suit of armor comprised of the material was a great expense. Due to his tabard being sullied earlier in the day, Aubry lacked the colors that distinguished him as a member of the royal family. If anything, he looked like a common man at arms. As such, few men in either army were aware of his identity. Aubry was taking part in his first battle. Though a legendary swordsman, he was by no means an experienced soldier, and as such, was quite nervous about the conflict. Currently, he was acting under the command of the Duke of Burgundy while the French forces fought against the English in a field within the Duchy of Burgundy. In Berengar's previous life, the Duchy of Burgundy would betray the French throne and side with the English in the next year. Of course, this had happened after the French royal heir assassinated the Duke. In this timeline, such a thing may not occur. After all, Aubry was the heir and was an entirely different person from the Crown Prince during Berengar's previous life. Aubry fought fiercely beside the Duke of Burgundy as the man advanced his forces against the English lines. As a petite and effeminate young man, Aubry lacked physical strength, especially compared to the veteran English knights he was facing. Thus he had to make up for his lack of power with his sword skills. He was currently protected by a great bassinet, which blocked his pretty face. His honey-blonde hair flowed out the back of the helm, creating the image in the minds of the English and French alike that he was a female warrior leading the charge against their enemies. His dainty feminine figure, clad in the slim armor, did not help resolve this confusion. The English longbowmen fired upon the French knights as they charged into the fray, atop their mounts. At the moment, Aubry was equipped with a lance and couched it under his arm as he rammed the tip of the weapon into the breastplate of an English knight, skewering the man upon impact. The heavily armored cavalry of both forces clashed into one another, sending knights and lords to their deaths. Perhaps it was God's will, but the effeminate prince managed to survive the charge, and so too did the Duke of Burgundy. As both armies struggled in a battle of life and death, Aubrey was unseated from his horse by a lance, and though it did not kill him, it surely dented his breastplate and broke one or more of his ribs. Gasping for breath, a tear formed in the young prince's eyes beneath the visor of his great bassinet as he struggled to breathe. The pain was unbearable, yet despite this, he slowly rose to his feet, where he unleashed his longsword from his sheath and used it to dodge an oncoming blow from an English man-at-arms. After deflecting the blow, Aubrey spun his blade around, gripping the cold steel by the hand and using the pommel to strike his opponent's iron helmet, caving it in and crushing the man's skull as he did so. A sharp pain, like a knife digging into his abdomen, dug its way through Aubrey's ribcage. With each movement, he felt as if he were going to pass out. Despite this, the young prince continued to struggle on the battlefield. If he did not fight, he would surely die this day. Thus, he twisted his sword around so that he was once more wielding it by the hilt and pierced through the gambeson armor of a nearby English soldier. With the young prince surrounded by the chaos of war, the Duke of Burgundy led the army and began to encircle his position. He could not allow the crown prince to die on his watch. Slowly, but surely the tides of battle began to change in favor of the French army, and eventually, Aubrey was relived by the courageous knights and men-at-arms of France who had caught up to him and allowed him a short reprieve from the battle. Aubrey winced in pain as he clutched the dented portion of his breastplate. Afterward, he was slowly led away from the battlefield by some nearby knights who were concerned for his safety. Aubrey was forced to retreat to the encampment while his soldiers fought without him. The field physician stripped Aubrey of his armor and clothes before examining the rib cage, where he shared the news with the boy. 3 of your ribs are fractured, you will recover in time. However, for now, I advise you to stay clear of the battlefield. One wrong move, and you could get yourself killed. After hearing this, Aubrey nodded before covering himself with a silk robe. The material was rare in France, but due to trade from some traveling Austrian merchants, the boy could get such a luxury, and he wore it whenever he got the chance. The prince clutched his side and winced in pain as he moved around. Shortly after that, the flaps to the tent opened to reveal the Duke of Burgundy with a grave expression on his face. The man was covered in the blood of his enemies, but he did not appear to be harmed in the slightest. When the physician had begun to examine him, the young duke, who was no older than 26, pushed him aside before barging over to Aubrey while wrapping the young prince in his blood-stained embrace. "Thank God you are all right. I don't know what I would do without you." After saying this, the man began to violate the prince's tongue with his own. Despite this act of passion, the prince did not turn away and instead accepted the gift. It was a little-known secret that the Duke of Burgundy and the French prince were in an illicit relationship. Though the duke was married and had 3 children, the moment he first laid eyes on Aubrey, he fell in love, and thus for the past 3 years, Aubrey had been in a relationship with the Duke of Burgundy. Of course, the Duke of Burgundy was just one of Aubrey's many lovers. He was a rather promiscuous young man, and thus he had more than one man by his side. He was even in a scandalous affair with several of his knights. The Duke of Burgundy had no way of knowing this. Thus he thought that Prince Aubrey was loyal only to him. After their little intimate display, Aubrey wiped the blood from the Duke's face before putting on a gentle smile and asking the question on his mind. "Did we win?" To this, the Duke chuckled lightly before nodding his head. "Would I be here if we hadn't?" Though this was good news, it was far too early to celebrate. The English invasion was not something to be taken lightly. The French had been fighting the English for decades, and yet the war was still entirely unresolved. With this said, the couple maintained silence for some time. Eventually, the Duke of Burgundy spoke his views on the conflict that embroiled the Kingdom of France. "This war is far from over. However, this victory is a good start. With our holy maiden leading the charge, the morale of our forces is stronger than ever." Aubrey was confused when he heard these words and spoke softly, as he was attempting to limit the amount of pain he felt from his broken ribs. "Holy maiden?" The Duke of Burgundy removed the gauntlet from his hand and wiped the bangs out of Aubrey's eyes. In doing so, he whispered into the young man's ear, "That's what our troops are calling you. They saw your honey hair and petite figure as you bravely charged the English knights. Without your tabard, the men have begun to think that you are a woman. This is why they are calling you the Holy Maiden. Rumors have already spread of your feat in battle, and the men are speculating about your origins." Some are even saying that you are a young woman of low birth chosen by God to lead the French to victory in our hour of need. If you ask me, it is a nickname fitting of your divine beauty." Upon hearing this, Aubrey began to blush as he looked to the side, not willing to gaze into the eyes of his lover. He was far from pious, in fact, one could call him the personification of lust. Despite this, he had been given such a beautiful nickname. After a while, the effeminate prince began to giggle like a girl. To him, it was the greatest joke he had ever heard. However, for the sake of morale, he would continue to present the image of a pious young woman. After all, what France needed now more than ever was a symbol to rally behind. Thus the lustful trap that was the Crown Prince of France had become the Joan of Arc of this world, while in reality behaving far more similar to the ancient Roman Emperor Elagabalus. Of course, the promiscuous character of the so-called Holy Maiden would never be revealed to the public at large, nor would his identity as the Prince of France. The war would continue to wage for some time. Who would win the 100 Years' War in this timeline had yet to be determined. Though with Berengar's intervention in this world's affairs, anything was possible. For now, the French would continue to fight against the English, as they had for decades. Chapter 265 The Holy Roman Emperor joins the fray. Within the Kingdom of Italy, in the city of Florence, there lies the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also the King of Italy. Sitting upon his mighty throne, within his palace, the middle-aged man of Italian descent gazed upon his ministers who reported the situation across the empire. One of the ministers was a tall and lanky man with a narrow face and a large hooked nose. He had a dark, unkempt beard that made him look particularly hideous. The man was dressed in silk robes imported from the Byzantine Empire. Currently, he held a document in his hands that he read from to the emperor. The German-speaking regions are embroiled in a war for the title, King of Germany. So far Duke Wilmar and the main Habsburg line has been eradicated, and with their deaths, so too has their claim ended. The man who seized power in Austria is a young upstart by the name of Berengar von Kufstein. As you may be aware, he is commonly referred to as Berengar, the Accursed. The man is a kinslayer, womanizer, heretic and has been excommunicated by the previous Pope Simeon II. With his rise to power, the German Reformation spread from southern Germany into the neighboring German duchies. Saxony and the Rhineland, in particular, are being converted at a rapid rate. Upon hearing this information, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man by the name of Balsamo Corsini, began to frown. As a devout Catholic, and a man with close ties to the current Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor dreaded the idea of the Berengar heresy spreading throughout the realm. However, the man contained his rage and spurred the minister to continue reporting. "Go on." Noticing the emperor's fury, the minister gulped down the saliva accumulated in his throat before continuing his report. The other two claimants for the title, as you know, are Duke Dietger of Bavaria and the legitimized bastard nephew of the previous king's brother. His name is Manfred von Luxemburg, if I am not mistaken. Manfred is the head of the Duchy of Luxembourg. He and his allies have begun to invade southern Germany. With the losses the Bavarians suffered in Austria, Dietger's forces are significantly weakened, and he is currently relying on his allies in Saxony and Württemberg to press his claims. Duke Berengar seems to be biding his time. He is either disinterested in the title or is amassing an army and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Intelligence supports the latter of these two outcomes as the most likely possibility. The Venetians have reported that Berengar is constructing 3 large shipyards. They speculate he intends to create a powerful navy to project strength across the Mediterranean. Though at this time, it is unknown whether these shipyards are designed for the construction of a trade fleet or an armada. Upon hearing the last part of this news, the emperor's frowning face worsened to an ugly state. It was becoming apparent that if Berengar was left to his own devices, he could prove to be a troublesome opponent in the future. Still, there was not much he could do about such a thing, short of trying to revoke Berengar's title of duke, which would force him into a war with the Austrians. There was no way for the emperor to enforce his will on Berengar and the Austrian people. Despite the Holy Roman Empire being more streamlined within its political structure in this timeline, it still suffered from the same faults of feudalism when it came to the centralization of power. The fact that there were limited lands within the crown's direct control meant that Balsamo would have a difficult time raising the forces necessary to invade Austria. Though he could rely on armies from Italy to answer his call to arms, the Germans were in the middle of a civil war, and so was Bohemia. The only other vassals he could call upon with any large force was the leader of the Swiss Confederation, and he was a man known for minding his own business. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was left with a headache, as he had no idea how to stem the growing tide that was the Duchy of Austria. Seeing that the Emperor was silent for an extended time, the minister began to speak of his reports again. The armies of Luxembourg and their allies have marched into Bavaria. After several battles back and forth between the von Wittelsbachs and the von Luxembourgs, it has turned into a stalemate, with the northeastern border of Bavaria under Luxembourg occupation. Only time will tell how long this conflict will last, and who will become victorious is still unknown. The war will likely continue for years without a clear victor. Unless we want to personally get involved, and declare the next king of Germany of our choosing, then I suggest we leave it be, and let the Germans settle their disputes by themselves. The Holy Roman Emperor nodded in agreement to this stance. He had no desire to waste his armies on the infighting of the German people. Instead, he was more interested in suppressing Berengar and Austria as best as possible. As such, he asked the question on his mind: what is the status of the Pope's attempts to rally enough forces for a new crusade against Berengar and his heresy? As he was asked this question, the minister began to frown and spoke gently, knowing that his following words would greatly upset the emperor. The Pope has his attention divided to Bohemia at the moment. The outbreak of the Hussite heresy and their war to overthrow the Bohemian crown is a more immediate threat when compared to that of Berengar and his heresy. As such, the timeline established to prepare an army to invade Austria has been delayed. Instead, what few forces the Vatican has gathered will be marching on Bohemia first. Though Berengar has taken a neutral stance in the war, our spies report seeing a large number of hand cannons and cannons in the arms of the Hussite forces. The number that they wield is far more than they should generally be equipped with. Thus, it is believed these weapons are manufactured in Vienna and transported into Hussite lands. However, none of this can be proven, as Berengar's agents are highly effective at counter-espionage. As such, whatever is occurring in Austrian lands is unknown to us at the moment. This news was enough to get the emperor to grind his teeth. It seemed as if this entire report presented to him was nothing but bad news. As such, the emperor began to lash out at his ministers. Is there any good news at all? Do any of you have a single idea on how to suppress Berengar and his rapid growth? Before long, that boy will be challenging my authority as emperor. Something needs to be done about this, and until the crusade is called, military conflict is not an option. The various ministers who were gathered all began to glance at one another in awkward silence. That is until one of the ministers began to speak up. We could impose taxes and tariffs upon Austria and their goods. This way, the Austrian economy will suffer, and Berengar, the accursed, will have a difficult time funding the expansion of his military? When the emperor heard this, he began to smile. This was a good idea. However, just as he was about to give the decree to place unfair taxes on Austria, another one of his ministers spoke up. Are you an idiot? First off, if we were to impose taxes strictly on Austrian goods, it would come across as the emperor bullying one of his vassals, which Berengar could use to breed conflict among the other vassals. That is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is Berengar could outright refuse to pay such taxes, forcing us with two options: lower our heads in humiliation, or invade Austria and fight a war that we are not prepared for. The moment the emperor heard this, all the joy that had momentarily filled his heart dissipated, as the minister who reigned on his parade had made a valid counter-argument against such an option. Thus once more, Balsamo and his ministers were scratching their heads trying to figure out a course of action. Ultimately, the ugly minister with the unkempt beard spoke up with the best option that the imperial crown had at the moment. If we wish to suppress Berengar's growth without giving him a casus belli, there is only one option. We must sabotage his industry. In doing so, we can maintain plausible deniability while still crippling his means to arm himself. The difficulty lies with getting our agents into Austria without being detected by Berengar's robust spy network. For starters, he is only accepting immigrants of German descent into Austria, leaving our options of spies solely from the Swiss Confederation. We will have to actively wage a war of intrigue against Austria and build up enough of a network to infiltrate into his industrial cities. Doing so could take months, if not years, to accomplish any results and would surely be costly. However, it is the best option available to us at the moment, aside from outright war. After hearing this, The gathered ministers began to mutter among themselves before agreeing to this proposition unanimously. As such, the emperor grinned from ear to ear, showing off his sickly yellow teeth as he did so. Afterward, he began to bellow in laughter before calming himself to a degree necessary to give his decree. So be it, Berengar. I would like to see how you prevent my agents from sabotaging your industry and crippling your economy. Thus the Italian kingdom and the imperial dynasty had begun to throw their weight into the fray. By sabotaging Berengar's factories, he would not only cripple Berengar's economy but also weaken the Byzantine Empire to the east, who the emperor had long since had a rivalry over with in regards to who was the true successor of Rome. Of course, getting past Linda's inquisitive gaze and that of Austria's intelligence agency is much easier said than done. After all, they had begun to rapidly expand across Germany and into northern Italy since they had started their reforms. What would follow would be a long and bloody shadow conflict between the Duke of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor. Chapter 266. A year goes by. A year had passed since Adela's birthday, and while the world changed around him, Berengar had been living in Kufstein, overseeing the reconstruction of the Duchy of Austria. The war with the Bavarians had left much of the land ravaged, and it was through great effort that the fields began to be restored, and the people returned to rebuild their homes with assistance from the state that Berengar had been establishing. Over the past year, Berengar had focused on 4 critical areas of development: agriculture, industry, infrastructure, and the military. In regards to agriculture, over the past year, the fields were resown, much to the help of the mechanized seeders that Berengar had begun to employ across the realm. The use of the steel plow and the mechanical seeder had greatly aided in the amount of farmland that could be utilized, while the fields were worked by significantly less population than was needed before. The 4-field system was implemented throughout the realm. Semi-modern irrigation was constructed across the fields, advanced fertilizers had begun to be employed, and selective breeding was introduced to livestock. Due to the massive amount of animal power needed to utilize combine harvesters, Berengar had spent a significant sum acquiring farm horses and mules to power these devices. In the end, he felt that this would be an essential investment, as the combine harvester combined the critical components of grain harvest such as reaping, threshing, gathering, and winnowing into a single process. With this invention, the work of thousands of farmers could be done by a handful of men. The only downside was that each combined harvester required 20 or more beasts of burden. To Berengar, it was well worth the price. The thousands of farmers who would typically be working in the fields doing all of these functions were now replaced by a single machine and a few men to operate it. The men who were previously employed in the fields could be put to work in industry, construction, mining, the military, or any other number of jobs needed in a semi-modern society. They could also undergo public education and further add to Berengar's scientific network. The agriculture of Austria had made a significant progress towards the early 19th century from Berengar's previous life. Within a decade, every field of Austria would be fully mechanized while utilizing advanced irrigation and fertilizers. The towns and cities destroyed or damaged during the Bavarian occupation had undergone reconstruction under Berengar's infrastructure initiative. It was a process that might take a decade, or possibly 2. Still, in the future, every city and central town of Austria would be made to a similar degree of security and sanitation that Kufstein now found itself in. Roads were being constructed across Austria to connect the major cities and towns of the realm. Roads were an essential feature for commerce, and Berengar intended to make sure that his roads stretched across the entire duchy. As for the industry, several critical industrial cities had begun to pop up aside from Kufstein. Innsbruck had long since been established as an industrial city. Within it, the arms and armor Berengar manufactured for the Byzantine Empire were mass-produced. Arquebuses, pikes, falconets, and mirror-pattern armor were mass-produced there and supplied to the Byzantine Empire under the agreement to be paid for in the future, after their conquests. The emperor had agreed to Berengar's terms and unknowingly fallen into a debt trap. As for Vienna, it had begun the production of even earlier arms and armor, which could be sold to any medieval army Berengar chose. They focused on the production of Byzantine armor, hand cannons, primitive medieval cannons, and any number of other medieval weaponry. Most of which was being given as military aid to the Hussites, under the terms that they would pay for it in the future, creating a sizable debt among the Hussite forces. Within Istria, the glass and salt industries had greatly expanded over the past year, and Berengar had stolen a large portion of the market from the Venetians, much to their ire. Berengar had more than once received an unfriendly letter from the Venetian Doge demanding he cease production of his superior glass. Of course, being the terrible aggressive and arrogant man that he was, Berengar's response to the Venetians' outrage was to politely tell them to go pound sand. This had worsened the relations between Venice and Austria to the point of a naval arms race. As for Berengar's cathedral and grand palace, he had decided not to go with concrete and steel construction. As such, he had the buildings entirely rebuilt from scratch in the form of more traditional materials such as granite and mortar. In particular, Berengar had used his chemistry department to formulate modern Type M mortar, the most robust and most durable type of mortar in existence within Berengar's previous life. It was also much quicker to set into stone, and as such, despite the traditional materials, the production rate of these structures was still more significant than that of the era. He would prefer that his cultural monuments last the test of time. Thus, it would be many years before he moved into a palace befitting an emperor. Then again, it would be many years before he became an emperor, or so he thought. During this era of peace, Berengar had also begun to reconstruct the city walls of Kufstein with granite and Type M mortar. Though the reinforced concrete walls allowed a greater level of protection against threats such as cannons, Berengar wanted his city walls to last the test of time, like that of the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. One day when people looked back upon the city of Kufstein, Berengar wanted these walls to be in place as a sign of his wealth and power during his reign. Thus, construction efforts across the realm were being made with more traditional materials, and the fortifications that Berengar had built with concrete and steel were being replaced and recycled. Austria held more than enough wealth to undertake such ventures, and Berengar knew it. However, out of all of Berniger's exploits over the past year, the most important was finished, and that was the construction of the shipyards. Berengar had poured an enormous amount of manpower and resources into the rapid construction of his 3 shipyards, and since then, they had been completed. 2 of his ports in Trieste and Pola were currently producing Berengar-class frigates at an unprecedented rate. Due to the prefabricated parts that Berengar had made during the last year, he had enough stockpiled in warehouses near those shipyards to construct dozens of vessels. With the assembly lines in place, Berengar had already built 5 frigates to comprise his first fleet. As for Fiume, the shipyard in that region had dedicated its production to manufacturing Berengar's merchant fleet, comprised of clippers. Though they had yet to set sail and bring his goods across the Mediterranean, it was only a matter of time before Austrians' goods were sold around the sea. The Grand Army of Austria had expanded to 50,000 men at this point, half of which were volunteers. The army paid well, and conscription would be mandatory the moment they went to war again. As such, many young men joined its ranks to prove their loyalty to the new regime, which had already begun to lift the peasants out of poverty. Berengar's forces were equipped with the 1,417 18th rifled musket, triangular bayonets, and quick loading tubes. The artillery comprised 14 17-12 pounds cannons, but they were also equipped with 14 18 Schmidt guns. There was no need for a dedicated howitzer since the 14 17-12 pounds cannon could act as a field gun in a howitzer. As for the cavalry, they were split into cuirassiers, lancers, dragoons, and hussars. Out of all the units of Berengar's army, he had the least amount of cavalry. Horses were expensive to purchase and maintain, and frankly, he did not need a massive amount of cavalry. His infantry was already so effective that cavalry was overkill. A year's worth of progress had been achieved, and it was no small amount. If things continued to progress in such a manner, Berengar would soon be able to proclaim himself King of Austria and stand on his own. Though he still desired to expand his wealth, influence, and power before that happened. After all, the moment he did so, there was a potential for war to break out, and Berengar was rather enjoying the progress he was making at the moment. Thus, for now, he would continue to develop his land until no army could challenge him. Border forts were still being constructed, and they would need to be finished before he ever thought about fighting a war for independence against the Holy Roman Empire. Thus at the moment, Berengar was sitting in his study, enjoying a sip of fortified wine as he gazed at the documents in his hands that described all of the progress that had been made in a single year. Money kept flowing into his treasury, and he spent a great deal of it to invest in his country. Now that his first fleet and his merchant fleet were constructed, he would begin his expansion into the Mediterranean and its trade. If he could sell his goods to every kingdom with a shoreline, he would be sure to make a vast fortune. Thus his immediate plan for the future was to expand his trade network, even if it angered those around him.